Greetings, everyone, for this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture, where we are proud to host a very special guest today, Dr. Raj Vedam, who has done enormous work over the recent years, piecing together a puzzle which really shouldn't even be a puzzle. If history had unfolded in a just way, we would all have access to the broader continuity of universal history, which ties us as individuals to something much broader and beautiful than many of us have been led to believe. And regardless of what culture, what part of the world we look at, there is a need to really piece together a lot of the misinformation, the false theories that have been put embedded as a minefield that obstruct us from really just seeing our various cultures in context of something much bigger. There's reasons for this, which perhaps we could discuss, and maybe this will be implicitly developed in the course of today's presentation. But for those who have been listening to the previous weeks and months of the Rising Tide Foundation lectures, the issue of cultural warfare, cultural dynamics, has been very, very high up on the agenda. Last week, we had a wonderful presentation by Irene Eckert on the topic of Germany and what happened, especially in the 20th century, to obstruct the more beautiful Renaissance traditions of Germany, of Schiller, of Goethe, especially after the situation of World War II, which in many ways has resulted in a lot of systemic folly, which has become normalized across much of the West today. We've had presentations on ancient China, on ancient Greece and Athens, and many of the geopolitical and cultural battles that have occurred in various spaces and times. And there's always something unique and universal that is being zeroed in on, which I think very interesting. So Dr. Raj Vedam has been able to approach something that many people have been afraid to address, dealing with matters of ancient Indian civilization, which also deal with certain very popular models that have become taught as gospel, which people are afraid to touch as sacred cows almost. But when you start scratching them, you find that there's really not much there. There's a foundation of sand. And the way that I think when Dr. Vedam was brought to my attention, what it really struck me was that he's not approaching it the way so many do from one single field or lens of specialization, but taking a full spectrum, multidisciplinary approach, looking at archeo-astronomy, archeo-genetics, archaeology, engineering, mathematics. There's so many things that Dr. Raj Vedam has been able to synthesize that has allowed for the triangulation into truths that some would have preferred to remain secret over a very long period of time. So I'm very happy that he's agreed to shed light on some of his research with us today. We'll have plenty of time for a Q&A. There is no direct time frame, as Dr. Vedam knows, for today's presentation. And everyone is familiar, I think, with at least one of his lectures and his biography. So I won't really go into any of that detail. But Dr. Vedam, it is all yours. I won't take up any more of your time.
Thank you, Matt. It's a real pleasure to come on your forum over here, and namaste to everybody. And let me straight away jump into this and share my screen. Tell me if you're able to see my screen. And I will not call attention to this temperature that you see over here. We are at 80 Fahrenheit down south.
Yes, we can see your screen just perfectly well.
So try to give an overview of some of the work that I have been doing. I see a message here, my internet connection is unstable. I apologize for that. The talk might appear perhaps jingoistic to some or very parochial to some and so on, but I'd like to assure you that I have been a recipient of certain kinds of information that me as a scientist wanted to explore the roots of some of the narrators, especially in science and technology, because I'm an engineer at heart and I'm an engineer. So I embarked on a quest to find where are the roots of modern sciences, mathematics, engineering, and all available narratives led to either ancient Greece or Babylon or Egypt and these kinds of things. And I found that my own country, India, was a non-entity over here. And that struck very odd because we have experienced a different kind of history narrative growing up, and that was completely at odds at what was being taught. So this led me on my quest over here, and that's what you're seeing here. And everything that I've done here is evidence based, and I'm open to criticism on that and perhaps changes and so on. So to begin and set the context for the talk, uh, we have several structural problems in the narration of Indian history. There is something that we refer to as a mainstream narration, which you learn in schools and universities the world over. And there appears to be something else, which is evidence-based. And that is what we're going to talk about today. I put a question mark in the evidence-based because this is our hypothesis now. Towards the end of the talk, I hope we'll be able to address, should these be questions or should we remove these question marks? So we have something called an Aryan invasion theory that is told to us, and the evidence seems to suggest it is an out of India. We are told that Indian thought only impacted all lands to the east of India, whether it is Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Japan, Korea, China, but it did not step 1 foot outside Afghanistan. Very, very strange kind of narrative, but we can show that Indic thought impacted the east and the west. They say that Indic civilization is recent, but we have evidence that shows it's a pretty ancient civilization. We are told that Indic thought borrowed from the Greeks and Babylonians, but we are seeing evidence that it seeded the Greek and Babylonian thought. We are told that Indians are a mix of Aryans, inverted quotes, and Dravidians and tribals, but then there is a lot of evidence that these identities are manufactured. And we're also told that the Vedic culture is responsible for the widespread poverty that was in India and there even today. But we see that invasions are responsible for widespread poverty. So right at the outset, we are seeing a completely contrasting set of claims here. How do we go about even addressing some of these things? So I apply an analytical approach to this whole field and say that one has got to examine the methodology. If somebody came the mainstream saying that there was an Aryan invasion theory, I'd like to see what data did you use? What were the methods that you applied? What were the models that you used? And what are the claims that come out of your narration? And do those claims hold up? So that is the kind of approach I've taken to this. And we will see that as we go through the talk. So at the very top, I'd like to say that Indian history has had several frameworks imposed on it, the historiography of India itself. So Indians have been very happy with the kind of history they had for the longest time. We have had something called Itihasas, Mahabharata, Ramayana, Puranas, which are all supposedly stories and timelines, chronologies and genealogies of kings and people, rishis, and so on. This has been a very sufficient way of history for Indians. Plus, there is epigraphy in temples that talks about the history, local history of the place, plus many, many families of genealogies that go back many, many, many generations. So this has been the notion of history for Indians. However, when the colonial people came, they needed to have an understanding of history to teach their civil cadre coming from Europe into India. So they wanted to learn who are these people that they are colonizing. And therein was born the historiography itself. And a certain narration of Indian history took root to serve the needs of the colonials. We'll examine this shortly. They were soon followed by the Eurocentric people. The Eurocentric people wanted to know, all right, we're learning so much about the Indians, it looks like the languages, Latin, Sanskrit, and Greek are related. And why is that so? How are we, white Europeans, related to the Indians? So that question led about in the 1800s and so on to all kinds of notions, especially with the nationhood struggles in Europe that we see in the time frame, led to several Eurocentric narratives. Wherever colonials went, they were followed by missionaries. So the missionaries had their own ideologies to put into the mix over here. And so they came with a set of narrations on Indian history, translation of Sanskrit works, and so on to serve their interests. And since 1947, when India got independence from the British, we have had, unfortunately, academia coming with a socialist narrative on the every aspect of social dynamics in India and so on. And since 1971, unfortunately, we have had the Marxists in addition, who have come and they control the education sector in India even today. So what we're seeing is these five actors and agencies are literally in bed with each other because they have ideologies that support each other. And the central notion here is you use history and ideology to subvert the identity for your needs. The colonials wanted to demoralize Indians that Europe is superior to you guys, you're primitive, backward, and so on. And we have got come here to save you, white man's burden, and all this stuff. And Eurocentrics obviously wanted to put some distance between India and Europe to show where these languages have come from. Missionaries, yes, they needed to convert the Indians to Christianity, and so they came with that view. And socialists and Marxists, they believe that all of history is a history of class conflicts, and you can create a classless utopia by removing the old order. Old order in India is the entire Indian civilization. By jettisoning that, they believe that you'll get a classless society. So this has meant that we have inherited a horrendously distorted history today, which is enforced by these frameworks. So let me quickly examine some of these things. The colonial and the missionary framework. So these things came with religious and racial bigotry and hatred, resulting in several Hindu-phobic works. And the start of scholarship, this kind of scholarship started with people like William Jones and Max Muller, who came to India. They examined many of the Indian works. For example, Max Muller, who saw the genealogies present in the Puranas. Puranas are accounts of Indian history, cosmology, encyclopedic works. And in this, they saw chronologies going back to exceedingly long periods of time. And they couldn't reconcile to that because these are products of the Anglican Church of that era, where they believed that God created the world in 4004 BCE and God destroyed the world in 3000 BCE, and nothing could have survived that flood event except the progeny of Noah. So that was their thinking. And when they saw Indian chronology going past this time frame, they took it on themselves that all this is corrupted chronology and we're going to correct it. And so they went about cherry picking dates from the Puranas, saying these kings are mythical, we'll throw them out, we'll move these kings here, move those kings here. And those kind of things were done. After which, prior to their machinations, the Puranic chronology had perfect internal matching with the Nepal king list, the Kashmir king list, the Purana king list, everything was matching. But after Jones and others had done what they did, the synchrony has been lost. Today it's irreconcilable. We cannot reconcile the chronology we learned today with what we have in the internal evidence of the Indian works. And so things like anchor dates for Chandragupta Maurya, for Buddha, for Adi Shankara, everything were manipulated in a sense to conform to certain ideas they had. And in addition to that, they presented India as primitive, backward, stagnant, and so on. It's a desire to uphold biblical history. That's the bottom line. And people may ask, do we have any evidence for these assertions? Well, we can't interview them today, but their writings survive and we can examine their writings. For example, in Asiatic research, William Jones said, either the first 11 chapters of Genesis are true or the whole fabric of our national religion is false. Another place, I'm obliged to believe the sanctity of the books of Genesis. So this was when he was confronted with the chronology in India and he could not reconcile to that. So they came with a mindset to alter these things. Max Muller, similarly, I look upon the creation given in Genesis as historical. So they imposed a young chronology in India, these notions of Aryan invasion, the discrediting of Indic sources that went contrary to what they were asserting, and recent linguistic dates for Sanskrit. All these things came from this ideological offensive. And some more to look at Max Muller in letters that he wrote in the time frame 1866, edited by his wife in this particular work. He says, this edition of mine, translation of the Veda, will to Indian, to show them what the truth is, I feel sure is the only way of uprooting all that has sprung from it from the last 3,000 years. So there you have it. His thinking is right there in his works itself. They were also followed by Anthropologists of that era were strongly Eurocentric. They were using Europe as the pinnacle of accomplishment, as the ideal, and looking at every other people in their lens, as inferior, primitive to be studied. So anyway, Herbert Risley was a census commissioner in British India. He used the discredited race science using craniometrics, using metrics of the nose, trying to say the height of the nose, width of the nose. He used that in all kinds of ratios to try and find races. This whole notion of race is spurious. But then he found races in India. All these colors are the races that he found, for example. And he entrenched the notion of Aryan as a race. Additionally, India has had no idea what caste is. We have something called Jati Varna system. Caste is an alien word. It comes from the Portuguese casta to represent the bloodline purity of white Europeans versus the mixing that was happening in the New World and so on. But anyway, that word was imported into India, entrenched in the census, and people were required to tell what their caste was in census that followed from there on. So those are the kind of things that Herbert Risley did. So moving on from colonial ideologies to Eurocentrism, linguistics, and toxic leftist academia, when we look at that, we see that ever since William Jones found commonality of Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek, Europeans have been on a quest for the Western identity. Who are they as a people, and what is their relation to Indians? So in their search for a homeland, they thought that there must be an ancestral language that is the ancestor of all the European languages and Indian languages, and that must have a homeland somewhere. So they searched for what that homeland is. And initially they thought India is the homeland. Eventually, they found the Mitannis and the Hittites in northern Iraq, southern Turkey, and places like that. And these people seem to have Vedic deities. They seem to have Sanskrit culture and so on. So they had some relation to the Sanskrit people. So they shifted the homeland in the late 1800s. Linguistic analysis was developing in that time frame. And so it so came about that Aryans who came from Central Asia had to be in India in 1500 BCE for some of their analysis to hold true. Then they discovered the Indus Valley civilization in the late 1800s. Marshall and others, they found that. And the theory became, looking at the ruins of the Indus Valley civilization, in 1900 it became an invasion, that these Aryans from Central Asia invaded this place, destroyed that Harappa civilization, and the methods they use are linguistics and archaeology. Now in 2000s, that invasion has been proven to be wrong. It has become a migration instead from the Proto-Indo-European homeland, and the methodology is one of linguistics, archaeology, and genetics, and we will quickly take a look at this. So the definition of this Aryan invasion migration is that bands of male warriors from Central Asia invaded or migrated to India around 1500 BCE. They effectively replaced the existing civilization thoroughly as far as language and religion and culture, and every aspect of it was changed with the Vedic ecosystem. And this is the theory based upon all of these things. So what is this linguistic theory they applied? So this whole field was born once William Jones saw this commonality of languages. Today it has evolved into these different things. Things like comparative linguistics, comparing the phonology, how sounds are made. Are sounds made at the back of the throat or in the front of the middle of the mouth, or the front, labial, dental, all these kind of things. And they use syntax, morphology of related languages, and they try to construct a proto-language. The problem is it is subjective. It is very informal way of developing laws and theories to go about it, and cannot be tested. And that is one of the biggest critiques of comparative linguistics. Lexicostatistics, based on a word list of some common words in different candidate languages, they identify the cognates and determine the statistical distance by percentage of cognates and so on. So the problem here is, how do you identify suitable cognates? A language might have multiple words for a certain phenomenon or and so on. How do you identify suitable cognates? So it's a cherry picking, pick and choose kind of thing. Glottochronology tries to infer a chronological relationship by assuming a rate of change. So the kind of sound laws, to give you a sample, are things like, if A greater than B means the sound A is older than sound B. or sound B is more recent. And Grimm's law is another such example where the sound ba, becomes pa, becomes fa. So they see an evolution in the way sound is made and propose certain chronologies, propose certain routes, how these things could have happened. Those are the frameworks in linguistics. So this is the time frame when Europe was going through enormous struggles in trying to define its identities and nationhood and so on. We can see what was going on there from 1500s to 1800s. So it turned out that this philologist, German Geiger, he was the first to suggest that the Indo-Europeans are blonde. How he got that, God alone knows. He pulled it out of a hat, blonde, blue-eyed, and these traits have become diluted and darkened in places where there's foreign admixture of genes. So this is a theory he pulled out of nowhere, and this became the received wisdom going forward. There were dubious interpretations of passages in Vedic texts. Translations, Vedic texts should never be translated. They had to be interpreted. However, certain kind of interpretations were made to produce readings of fair, invading Aryans clashing with snub-nosed indigenous dasas. So another German, Theodor Porsche, in this time frame, he furthered the blonde cause and even simplistic logic. He accepted without question the original Aryans spoke Indo-Europeans and were blonde. So these were the manufacturings of ideas born about through peculiar reasons in Germany and other places. An Indian thinker at that time, 1936, stated, Germanism arose among the peculiar political conditions of 19th century Germany. There is no reason why in India should pin anthropological faith in it. So he was critiquing the Indian thought at that time who were buying wholesale whatever notions of linguistics are coming in that time frame. So this whole search became one of, all right, we have reconstructed with linguistics Proto-Indo-European language. Now the question is, where is that homeland? So the search for the homeland turned out to be a search fight in the nationalistic ideas of Europe itself at that time. The homeland was situated in various places, whether in northwest India, the Caucasus Mountains, or in the Central Asia over here, or in Germany over here, and so on. So various compulsions pulled people in various directions to figure out where this is, and finally they landed on Central Asia, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. That is where these Aryans are supposed to be, because that is equidistant from Europe on this side and from India on this side. That was a statistical reason, but that's how it landed up. Eventually, this is the model that is presented even today to show the relationship between languages. A hypothesized language has been reconstructed called Proto-Indo-European, whose daughter languages are Balto-Slavic, Germanic, Celtic, Italic, Hellenic, Indo-Iranian, Iranian, Indic, Sanskrit, and these languages. So this is done using comparative method, and this is an idealization. However, this is now accepted without question that this is the way languages have evolved. And to give you a flavor for how the Proto-Indo-European language was evolved academically, there's no evidence that anybody spoke it anywhere. There is no archaeological evidence, no epigraphy, no nothing, not even oral records of this one. So it's a complete academic reconstruction in the Europe of those days and carried forward till today's received wisdom. So if you look at this PIE example for the wheel, even today in India, in the villages, you find this very familiar bullock cart with this familiar wheel. It is there in Harappa. Wheel has been known even in Ukraine, the Vincha culture and other places going back to ancient period of time. So if a civilization possesses technology, for example, the bullock cart, you must have words in your language to represent the technology. So we see the words for in Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, Hittite, Tocharian. The wheel is chakra in Sanskrit, rotum in Latin, kuklos in Greek, and so on. Yoke is yoga, lugam. Nave is nabya, umbilicus, axis, axa or axis. And the proposed reconstruction from this hypothetical PIE is that they say there was a word in PIE, whenever there's a star, it means it's not a real word, it's a reconstructed word. A reconstructed word called kweklo. If I'm pronouncing it right, that gave rise to the reconstruction. So the irony of this whole thing is that to reconstruct the PIE language, the data available was only in Sanskrit. Sanskrit and existing European languages were used with these elaborate set of rules in a band-aid fashion. If one rule could not cover a certain counterexample, a new rule was proposed to cover that in a band-aid kind of fashion. That's why it's an informal, subjective way of growing. And once this construction was done, they reversed the assumptions into facts and made PIE into a fact, and that Sanskrit is derived from that. This is the absurdity of this entire field. So we also see there's a fusion of linguistics and archaeology in recent times, again to find the Western identity. This person, Gustav Cosina, to defend the German homeland. So this person said the movement of people can be linked with ceramic changes in archaeological record, the corded ware, the linear ware archaeological cultures, indicative of Aryan dispersals. So these kind of ideas also influenced the very famous Maria Gimbutas later. She also used a similar kind of thing over here. Today we have two modern narratives. These are the thought leaders, Maria Gimbutas, Colin Renfrew. Maria Gimbutas comes with the Kurgan or the steppe hypothesis. And in her version, it says that the Indo-European language expansion happened in three waves between 4000 BC to 1500 BC, with the domestication of the wild horse, the invention of iron and chariots. They went about conquering the world. That is her notion. The Anatolian hypothesis by Professor Colin Renfrew says that the invention of agriculture in Anatolia, that is the one that led to the spread. As agriculture was spreading, language to spread by 6500 BCE. Today, there are some people who claim that genetics favors Kurgan, and you find from time to time papers on Anatolian hypothesis too. Kurgan steppe hypothesis says 3500 BCE, these people between the Caspian Sea, Black Sea, the Yamnaya culture. At that time, remember, this is not a story of mankind because civilization already existed in India. Harappa, Bhirana, Meghar, Bhimbetka, Lothal, Edekal, Sumeria, in Egypt, in China. We had activity going on all over the place. This is the story of the Western identity here. So these people are supposed to have come, domesticated the horse and started their movements. And by 2500 BC, they spread to the west, becoming the corded ware people, to the east, the Andronovo people. Consolidation here, Indus Valley, Elamites, Sumerians, Egyptians, we see all of these things. By 1500 BC, it says that we see the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the other people over here, Babylonians, and here you see the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. And these people enter into India here in the Sindh region, and this is the beginning of the Aryan invasion theory, according to the Kurgan hypothesis. And by 500 BC, they have entrenched in northern India, and you see the appearance of Dravidians here, supposedly driven from the north into the south, the beginning of the divide and rule kind of ideas in India. So what we're seeing is these frameworks have enforced the narrative, the colonial hegemony, which not just the British, Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British, along with Christian imperialism, missionaries like Robert Caldwell, Geo Pope, and many, many others, along with Eurocentrism, linguistics, and methods of anthropology, caste, and others, with Max Muller, Herbert Risley, and others, with circular arguments, convergent ideologies. We have Aryan invasion coming out, which is imposing a major constraint on all of Indian history or deep history narrations. You might think that we live in enlightened times, and so we can do away with these methodologies. Unfortunately, it is not the case. Newer narratives, frameworks reinforce these narratives. They take them as received wisdom and try to align all the studies today along with the narratives that have come from 1800s. So we are seeing, well, like I said, Maria Gimbutas, Colin Renfrew, Marshall, archaeology, and Aryan migration received wisdom in academia today with outsider sociology. Sociology that's appropriate for the Western experience is imported into India and force fit over there. And we see that kind of thing happening. And we see today genetics, people like David Reich, Harvard Medical School, and others who use circular dependencies, constraints from archaeology, constraints from linguistics are used to generate theories in genetics, and that's what we see. Into this toxic mix, we also see Marxist ideologies today. So Karl Marx, all of us know over here, the fantasies of a utopian classless society. They see all of history as a history of class struggles. That's all there is to it. It's who was oppressed, who was the oppressor, and all of history is just these fights between oppressors and oppressed. And after a bloody revolution, one can change all of these things to a classless society. And the only difference between socialism and communism is that in communism, they see a violent revolution to change the social order, whereas in socialism, they see change and reform within the democratic process. Otherwise, they're joined at the hip. They come with the same ideology that you need to jettison the past, which is all a history of conflict, and move forward with certain kind of notions. Into this mix have come certain ideas of European Enlightenment also, things like modernism and postmodernism. All these ideas arise out of frameworks that came out of the European experience. Now, you might think that, all right, you got rid of the British in 1947, so India should be in charge of its own destiny, right? Unfortunately, that did not happen because we inherited Nehruvian socialism. Nehru was an anglicized Indian who was educated in London, had very, very upper class or elitist kind of notions, and he was deracinated. He could not connect with the Indian civilization. He was a member of the Fabian Society over there, where it was a group formed for the ideology of socialism in Britain of those times. So he came with those ideas, entrenched socialism in India, where the new India did not make any attempt to reclaim the past and the identity. Rather, a break was done that the past is primitive and has to be thrown out, similar to what we saw in the colonial and other kind of ideas. And going forward, certain ways of narrating Indian history took root. Since 1971, for political survival, his daughter Indira Gandhi, she made a pact with the devil, literally, and they wanted only the human resources development and education sector for political pro quid pro kind of thing. That's all they wanted. And so since then, once this person is appointed as the Minister for Culture and Education, they have created and appointed and controlled the entire ecosystem of socialist and Marxist education. All the bodies today in India, academic bodies, are controlled by this kind of ecosystem, and they've completely eradicated the internal scholar, the scholar who does not subscribe to any of these things. In the last 50 years, they have been removed from every university and every other place. Very, very unfortunate. Here's just a sampling of some of them: Ram Sharan Sharma, Romila Thapar, Irfan Habib, Bipin Chandra, Satish Chandra, and so on. They have come with a certain kind of offense over here where they make Hindus, invaders, migrants, 1500 BC, disconnected from India, Indus Valley civilization, disconnected from India, and several kind of issues are here, over-reliance on the Western social lens to understand Indian social dynamics, very, very perverted way of looking at things. And we see in the textbooks distortions, erasures, biases, errors, misrepresentations, semantic distortions. These are the hallmarks of the present narrative, and that's what we have found in our analysis of these texts. So the outsider frameworks have resulted in tremendous loss of identity of Indians today. An average Indian has no clue who he is. So it's a bastardized identity of something from the West, something from India, something from there, and there's a concoction of things. That's what we see. So we see colonials who came with the notion to uphold biblical chronology, show Hindus primitive, backward, stagnant, Eurocentric, show Hindus backward, stagnant, superior to the white Europeans. Missionaries who came with all of these frameworks to uphold the chronology, show Hindus as backward, and to promote Christianity and show class conflicts. By showing class conflicts, they hope to divide the society and convert. Socialist academia, same kind of thing, show Hindus as primitive, backward for the conflict idea, and the subaltern kind of ideas, history from below, conflict dynamics, and all these kinds of things, and Marxists similarly. Today, we are also seeing deracinated frameworks from the southern part of India, what we call Dravidianism, that also has adopted a lot of these notions, and we see conflicts in India because of these things. So we are seeing clearly that distortion of Indian history has led to enormous problems in present-day India. And I'd had to say a lot about that. There's a lot to say, but let's just move on. There's an impact of spurious Aryan invasion migration narrative in India. So this notion that Aryan invasion in 1500 BC was led by nomads from Central Asia who were illiterate, by the way. They did not have a script. They were illiterate. illiterate people. They destroyed Indus Valley civilization. They were just as Vedic people, a caste system and other such things. Before Magadha, which is in the eastern part of India, they made contact with the Greeks, and the Greeks helped Indians to get civilized. And you see Ashokan script, Brahmi, and other things coming. So they say, you are a young civilization. You haven't had enough time for gestation of knowledge, whether it is in mathematics, astronomy, medicine. How could you have all these advanced knowledge? So you must have learned from the Greeks, Babylonians, Egyptians, and so on. So today we are seeing notions like this, that astronomy came to India from the Babylonians, the Brahmi script came from Aramaic into India, the Greeks brought math and sciences into India, Aryans from Central Asia got Sanskrit into India, the Turkic Muslims got culture, cuisine, architecture, music, and civilization to India. The British got science, technology, and rational thought to India. And today we're also told that the Bhakti movement came from St. Thomas, who landed on the west coast of India, and so on. So we see that there's a denial of agency to Indians in narration of our own history, and that has led to a gross distortion of identity and very divisive forces based on spurious ideologies. So this is what I'm addressing. All along till now, I've just presented what the problem is. And what I'm hoping for the rest of the talk is I'm going to rebut all of these things. And the rebuttal will be made only by looking at evidence. Where is evidence? What is evidence I'm presenting? And how do we rebut these things? So what we learned in the earlier part is that linguistics is a framework. It came amidst the problems of colonial wanting to rule India, among the Eurocentric notions, among the missionary interests, and so on. And today it's upheld by socialist academia and the Marxists who control the education sector. That is what we are seeing, and it has led to tremendous problems. So the rebuttal needs to be, again, evidence-based on a rational examination of facts. The very first thing, it is staring at us in the face. India has got one of the largest number of ancient texts. If you take any civilization from anywhere on the earth and try to find out how many different documents or works that you have, India has got thousands literally of works. And in these works range from very ancient periods of time till 1,000 years or so. I just have a sampling of some of them over here. In not a single person's work, you find that there has been an Aryan invasion into India, that people invaded, or we, the Indians, came from somewhere else in Central Asia or elsewhere, or that we are North Indians and South Indians. None of these narratives are present. These narratives happened after the British came to India and told us we are two people. Only after that it came. So this is one of the ironic things, that we completely discard the internal evidence. And there's a reason why that happened. The British did that. They positioned all of Indian works as unreliable and cannot use it for internal evidence. Perhaps this is the only civilization that is denied agency. Whether you take the Greeks, the Chinese, the Egyptians, or the Sumerians, or the Akkadians, or the Babylonians, everybody's text is used to define them. In India alone, we find denial of agency. None of these texts, none of these evidences are used to narrate Indian history. So on deconstructing the linguistic model, there are two thought leaders over here, Srikant Thalagiri and Nicholas Kazanas. So Srikant Thalagiri, he wrote these two books over here, analyzed deeply the history of, and looked at Sanskrit, the narrations, the models and linguistics and so on. And his conclusion is, the Proto-Indo-European homeland, if it is in Northwest India, then it aligns with the evidence of archaeology, history, as well as the linguistic model itself. If you locate this homeland in Central Asia, he found many contradictions as far as the Mitannis, the Hittites, and many other evidences that he found. He said there's a problem over here. On the other hand, Nicholas Kazanas, who wrote these two books, he had very, very strong views. He said, in his view, all the mainstream academic publications on this reconstructing PIE is utterly worthless. And the reason is, he said, if you look at comparative religion of the Scandinavian people, the Nordic people, and all these other, including the Vedic deities and so on, he said, if there is a common connection point, it is so old that you don't have any data to reconstruct that ancient language. Even this supposition of 3000 BC is nonsense. He thought it is much, much more ancient than that. So he too came out with strong views, and this is a sampling of a couple of people who have contested this model. Then there are many researchers today who have called out this whole notion of invasion as spurious. For example, Marshall was a British archaeologist who discovered this Harappa civilization and he worked on it. So when he wrote his early papers, he said Mohenjo-daro had thrived from 3250 to 2750 BCE, ending 1,000 years before the Aryan's supposed arrival in 1931 in his work. That's what he said. Unfortunately, Mortimer Wheeler was a British archaeologist who came in the 1940s or so. He brought that chronology forward in time from 2500 BC to 1500 BC to make it convenient for invading Aryans to have brought about the end of the Indus cities. Then, with convenient readings of the Rig Veda, he also said very famously that Indra stands accused. What you're saying is that the Rig Veda is a text where you see invaders coming in and destroying cities. Indra is called Purandara. Purandara means a destroyer of cities. So he says Indra stands accused. These people came and destroyed the civilization and so on. So these are the kind of ideas that were brought about by looking at what they called skeletal evidence and other such things. So there was also embellishment that happened in this particular time frame. So we see, for example, Kosambi, who is the father of Marxist historiography, he said that Indus end came in 1750 BCE. The termination was abrupt. The city was set on fire. Inhabitants were slaughtered. Evidence of violent end. And enemies are ruthlessly smashed in battle. Treasures looted. Cities burned down. Victory of barbarism. The Aryans he referred to as barbarians over here, or a far superior urban culture, referring to Harappa. That was the way they positioned this, and all this is called out by Michel Danino in his work in 2016. And the invasion was pretty soon challenged. We see that Sanskrit scholar P.V. Kane, he argued in 1953 that extrapolating a man-made destruction of a huge city like Mohenjo-daro from finding a few skeletons is unjustified. Then in 1964, the American scholar Dales, he pointed out that the skeletons in question that were used to justify the invasion were found in different epochs of the city. They don't even belong to a point in time where you can say they all belong over here. Then Dales further said there is no destruction level covering the latest period of the city, no sign of extensive burning, no bodies of our warriors clad in armor, surrounded with weapons of war. Not a single bit of evidence can be brought forth as unconditional proof of armed conquest, destruction of the supposed scale of Aryan invasion. Then Kenneth Kennedy is one more American bone specialist and historian. So he brought some more thoughts over here to bear upon this analysis. He said that the analysis of the injuries in the bones of most Harappa Mohenjo-daro skeletons had healed well before death, which means these were not specimens that died over there, but the bones show signs of healing. So clearly, several issues over here can be called and challenged over here. Today, there are two sides of the debate. People who assert AIT say linguistic implies a common ancestral language, homeland for ancestral language, dispersion by invasions and migration. People who reject it say A, B, and C do not prove the Central Asian homeland. Shrikant Talagiri, for example, says if you locate that homeland in northwest India, all the inconsistencies fade away. Archaeology in Indus Valley, they say Harappa shows signs of evidence of destruction. Experts have said there is no destruction, no fires, no mass killing. Then today, genetics, we'll learn a little bit about this later, is talking about a certain marker from Central Asia and India implying migration. Many scholars have studied this and there's no consensus on this. Majority opinion is that R1A originated in India and spread outwards. Then AIT asserts there are two races in India, only possible because Aryans invaded India and drove the original people to the south, the Dravidians. Then the reality is the racial theory is bogus. Many genetic studies show no significant differences between Indians. And two language families in India, according to AIT, the Indo-Aryan and the so-called Dravidian. The reality is India is a language sprackband, meaning it's a linguistic area, meaning that there's a place where for a long time languages evolved. into many different things. So we'll find out why this is relevant, is mythical. But then satellite imagery showing there was an ancient riverbed, which Rig Veda is referring to as a mighty river Saraswati, which dried up in 1900 BCE, 400 years before the supposed Aryan invasion theory. So how on earth could these Aryans have come in 1500 BCE and spoken about a mighty river if that river did not even exist in 1500 BCE? We look at astronomy, and Max Muller said it's unreliable, but we are seeing many ancient dates on archeo-astronomy. We'll see that shortly. So having presented that first attack on the Harappan archaeology with archaeology supposedly about the invasion and saying there's no invasion, we take a look at the antiquity of the Indian people. How old are these people? Because we are told that it's from 1500 BCE and so on. So I have several talks over there where I've talked extensively about this one. I won't go into details over here. But archaeology and paleontology show great antiquity in India. There are artifacts that have been recovered from 1 million years ago, which is apparently the Homo erectus, the specimen that used to live in India, that species. Then we have skull of the Narmada man 350,000 years ago, or from southern India, Atirampakam 350,000 to 180,000 years ago, artifacts have been found. And these are much before the genetic evidence of migrations into India from Africa. We're finding that there was a species living in India at this time frame. 40,000 years ago, cave art, tools from all over India. Then there are ports and settlements below the Bay of Bengal, which have been submerged since the last 15,000 years. The last glacial maximum, ice ages, the late glacial maximum, was 18,000 years ago when water was locked up in ice and ancient seabeds were exposed at that time. And recent papers have shown there are settlements in Pumpuhar, 25 kilometers out into the Bay of Bengal at a depth of around 125 meters. So in 10,000 years ago in southern India, caves in Edakal as well as in Birana, underwater artifacts from western India in Dwaraka 8,000 years ago, and what I call recent artifacts from 5,000 years ago in Harappa, Saraswati, Ganga Plains, Kirdi, Arikamedu, and so on. So we got a whole lot of evidence, archaeology showing widespread presence of Indians in India for a long time. Looking at genetics itself, so in genetics, people initially started looking at the X and Y chromosome and the markers that arise from therein to try to talk about migrations of ancient people. This whole field came about in the 90s with a discovery by Luca Cavalli Sforza. He's a professor who said that differences in the genome between different populations tell a story of migrations and so on. So if you take a look at the maternal mitochondrial DNA, the haplogroups over there, and try to trace the antiquity of the present day humans, what we're seeing is that the markers, these are mutation markers, if you will, identified by scientists with different marker names. L0 to L6 are all inside Africa. Outside of Africa, we see the mutations M and N haplogroups, and the rest of the world has been derived from M and N haplogroups. And these turn out to be haplogroups present in India, as you can see in this map over here, that L0 to L6, these are all inside Africa itself. Then this migration out, we are seeing N and M over here, and this R goes into Europe. And from there, we are seeing migrations through Southeast Asia to Australia, to Siberia, to North and South America, and everywhere else. And the age of this, so this black arrows 90 to 55,000 years ago, these are the migrations over here. And this orange one is 55 to 30,000 years ago. And this green one that you see here is around 30,000 years ago. And this blue one is around 10,000 to 1,000 years ago in Polynesia. So this is the data we can recover, the signal we can recover from analysis of the maternal mitochondrial DNA on how the world was populated by modern humans, if you take this particular marker as an example. What about the Y chromosome, the male Y chromosome mutations? Well, the women can't do it alone. So if you see the trace of women's signal there, the man should not be far behind. And that's what you see here. A0 to C, these mutations are all in Africa. And out of Africa, we're seeing the F, G, H, I, J, K up to L. All these happen to be in India, and it is from India that the rest of the markers are present in the remaining parts of the world. And that's what we see in this map for the Y haplogroup, that these early ones are in India. You see the F and this GHIJKL over here, this black arrows 100,000 to 50,000 years, then migrating into Europe, migrating into Southeast Asia 50,000 to 25,000 years ago, then the red one going into Americas, and so on. So this is what the maternal mitochondrial DNA in the Y chromosomal are telling us. And we can see a nice animated work from Stephen Oppenheimer. He's talking about the journey of mankind based on the maternal mitochondrial DNA. Important to note that from the Narmada man, from Atirampakam, India's got evidence of archaic humans present in India before this migration signal from Africa. That's what important to note here. So here he says modern humans rose before 150,000 years ago. A group of them left and crossed at Oman and hugged this coast, came into India, triangular part of India, all of these places, about 85 to 75,000 years ago. They did not venture west because the Neanderthals range was up to Iran, Chagai Hills of Iran. So they did not want to confront them. India had thick jungles. They were hugging the beach literally to go over here. These are the reasons, generation by generation migration. Then around 75,000 years ago, a super volcano erupted in Sumatra, and that caused a 6-year nuclear winter, an instant 1,000-year ice age, with a crash in the population to less than 10,000 adults. And even today, we can get the volcanic ash, which is 5 meters deep in India and Pakistan. This is a place in Jwalapuram in Andhra Pradesh, where even today they're finding the ash layer. So after that, what we're seeing is that intense cold 74 to 65,000 years ago, a repopulation of India took place from this side. And 65,000 years ago, the ice ages had ended in Europe, and that coincided with the dying of the Neanderthals, and modern Homo sapien filled that vacuum from this part of India going into Bosphorus. We saw all these signals in the empty DNA in the Y chromosomal work. And later on, 45 to 40,000 years ago, spreading and moving to all parts of the world, crossing the Bering Strait 25,000 years ago. And so this is the story. So people say, all right, all this is ancient stuff. We are talking about language migrations. People who brought this language, Sanskrit, into India. This is in the last few thousand years or so. So the quest is on for the so-called language gene. Empty DNA and Y chromosomes have indicated Indic origin. They failed to validate the linguistic model. The focus was on R1A after a particular professor called this out, saying that this is a relevant area to look into. So many people focus attention on R1A, one of the mutational markers. So I put a list of several researchers here till 2010, Bashu, Kevisel, Cordiu, Sengupta, and others, and their opinion on where R1A originated. And what we're seeing is that some of them say Central Asia, Southern Asia, Central Asia, North India, Southern Asia, South Asia, and so on. So there is a mix of opinions here, but people seem to be leaning towards South Asia as the place where it originated. And 2018, David Reich from Harvard Medical School, who's very much in the news these days, he pioneered what he called genome-wide research. He said, why do you look at just the gender chromosomes? We humans have got 22 autosomes and one pair of gender chromosomes. Let's look at the autosomes in addition. So using today's technologies, they're able to recover to a great extent ancient DNA from samples, all the autosomes and not just the gender chromosomes. 2018, he claimed that Indians were a mix from 7000 BC Iranian pastoral farmers who landed in India. And later on, 3000 BC, these people came to India, and 1500 BC, Central Asians, and this is the North Indian, ancestral North Indian, ancestral South Indian. At that time, I said, I had several talks I'd given in Delhi and other places. I said, there's a problem in this thing. You do not show the signal of out of India. We have Vedas and Puranas that are talking about a Drihyu who migrated out of India following a certain battle in a certain time frame. We have internal evidence from the Bhagavad Purana, Vishnu Purana, Vayu Purana, Brahmanda Purana, Matsya Purana, Rig Veda. I said, am I supposed to throw out all my internal evidence of my civilization so that you come and say that the signal is there? There's a problem. The red flag has gone up. There's some data that does not fit your model. Either your model is wrong, your data is wrong, your methods are wrong, or your conclusion is wrong. Those are the only 4 areas you can investigate this. Incorporated 11 more ancient samples in cultural contact at Iran with Indus Valley civilization, and they invalidated their earlier claim that Iranian pastoralists had come to India. They instead said Indians seem to be a separate branch of themselves, and we are seeing, however, he stuck on to his claim saying that in 1500 BC, there is this signal they're seeing coming into India. And there's one more paper in that same time frame, 2019, which talked about the Harappa gene. They recovered from one of the skeletons enough DNA content to do an analysis. And that analysis said that the so-called Indus Valley clan is a pretty ancient one, showing some traces of Andamanese hunter-gatherers with a common link going before 10,000 BCE. And these people seem to have gone, or this orange color seems to be here, Iranian hunter-gatherers going on to Iranian herders, until Iranian farmers in 4000 BC, who are showing some Anatolian input also. From Anatolia, we are now seeing some ingression into Iranians, but from India, we are seeing an outgression over here into these places. That is what this is showing. All right, very quickly, evidence from other areas that don't fit this Aryan invasion. The river Saraswati. This is a big headache. This is a big headache for the people who push this Aryan invasion theory, because there are dozens of settlements that have been found along this ancient river course, and it's mentioned prominently in Rig Veda. Where is this? If this is today's Indus River with its 5 tributaries over here, parallel to that was an ancient river called Saraswati. This is mentioned in the Rig Veda as a prominent flowing river from the Himalayas down to the ocean. The problem is that this river dried out in 1900 BCE. We know that from a whole lot of geological studies. This paper, for example, is talking in 2019, talking about the presence of this river by analysis of the minerals in the soil and other such things. How could Aryans have come in 1500 BCE, written the Rig Veda in India, talking about flowing river, if that did not exist? That's a big problem over here. And we are seeing, this is a paper that came out in 2013, a summary of many archaeological studies done in the Saraswati basin. We are finding that all along this extinct river, we are finding settlements. If Aryans had come in, why on earth would they settle down in places like this? And so we are finding the settlements and radiometric dating. I've just highlighted some dates over here. Megar. The most ancient date over here is 9,000 years before present, or 9,300 years before present. In Kalibangan, we are seeing a date which is around 6,000 years before present, or even more ancient than that. And in Rakigadi, we are seeing 6,000 years before present over here. And in Birana, we are seeing 7,500 years before present. So what we're seeing is that archaeological evidence and radiocarbon dating is finding settlements that are pretty ancient, much before the so-called Aryan invasion theory. Then one of India's most respected archaeologists, B.B. Lal, he's been in the field for a long time. He's been there, he's a pretty old man, he's around 99 years or so now. So he, after his decades-long research in this field work, he came to the conclusion there is no periodization observed in the archaeological record of India. He said there is no Harappa period followed by a Vedic period. Instead, he said there's a continuity of civilization seen, whether it is the so-called Pashupati seal showing Shiva, Proto-Shiva over here, a Vedic entity, the Swastika, which is a sacred symbol, not to be confused with the Nazi crooked cross. That's not the same thing over here. There's a Swastika, a very symbol of auspiciousness in Hindu culture. So this is found in Mohenjo-daro, whereas it's a Vedic, so-called Vedic symbol. Then entities, terracotta figurines that show the women over there wearing the sindoor mark. Hindu women wear the sindoor mark as a mark of marriage and so on. This seems to have this cultural continuity from Harappa times. Then a terracotta figurine showing Namaste. Namaste is an idea that says the divinity inside me is bowing to the divinity inside you. So this is a deeply Vedantic concept which sees no separation from creator to created. That is there in Harappa. What is that doing? It's a Vedic concept. The Shivalinga, as well as yoga asana poses, all these were examples of continuity of the civilization. Presence of iron. We were told that Aryans brought iron into India in 1500 BCE. However, today we have found iron all over India with carbon dating to 2005 or 200 BCE itself. This is a paper that came out sometime 2015 or so. And there are several other works that have talked about this, that iron is present, invalidates this particular one. Chariots in Saraswati civilization. We are told that Aryans brought chariots and horses to India. However, archaeology has shown not one or two, but many chariots in a place called Sanauli in Uttar Pradesh. And these date back to 2200 BCE, much before the so-called Aryans. Cattle genomics. Now, this is a paper that came in Science in 2019, and these people said that they found that the zebu is a humped bull that you see in India, very familiar bull that you see in India. They say that this suddenly came in the Mitanni lands in Anatolia and places like that 4,200 years ago. They're saying that a region-wide Bronze Age shift indicates a rapid, widespread introgression. Very important words here, rapid and widespread, of zebu, Bos indicus from Indus Valley, stimulated by the onset of a widespread multi-century drought 4,200 years ago. They favored the Indian bulls because they were adapted to drought. It was very, very valuable there. In fact, we see that in an Akkadian seal. For a long time, I wondered, why is Akkadian seal showing Indian bulls and other such things? But after these papers came out, I could make out the connection. It was very important in that culture to have these drought-resistant animals over there. The same paper that talks about this one. The next one is wild rice and cultivated rice in India from 9,000 years ago. We are told that agriculture was invented in Turkey, Anatolia, and in 7,000 BC, and it spread into India. However, this paper in 2018 is saying that paddy cultivation was from the early Holocene. Holocene is from around 12,000 years ago. Evidence from the Ganga Plain, Lahuradeva lake sediments analysis has shown paddy was grown over here. This is very interesting. This paper from Genome Biology in 2007, this paper talks about the genomics of the common house mice. And it says that the ancestor of the house mice lived, surprise, in India. It is from India that it migrated out to Africa, to Europe, to Southeast Asia, China, and all over the place. We know that wherever there's agriculture and migrations of humans, mice typically go behind them because they take the leftovers and all that. So this is a strange affirmation of some of these ideas of out of India from the genomics of the mouse. I'll go to an entirely different area now. I talked about antiquity of the Indian civilization. I presented some from archaeology. I talked about the river Saraswati. I talked about radiometric dating from Saraswati. I talked about little data points from various areas, Iron Age, chariots, as well as this genomics of the mouse, genomics of paddy, genomics of cattle, to show these ideas of out of India migrations. I'd like to now talk to you about the antiquity of the Indian civilization as observed in Indian astronomy. Indian astronomy contains various observations by people of the past, and those observations can be dated rather precisely. And the reason for that is Indians made sidereal measurements. They identified where a certain star or a collection of stars were at the cardinal points of astronomy. Cardinal points of astronomy are the winter solstice, summer solstice, and the two equinox positions. So they identified what constellation or star was there at different periods of time. And we know that these positions will change over time. Why do they change? Because the Earth has got at least 3 degrees of motion, the so-called, if you look at the Milankovitch cycles, you'll learn that. So we have the rotation of the Earth, which is happening once in 24 hours. The revolution, 365.24 days. In addition, where the Earth is pointing to in the sky, right now the axis of rotation is pointing to Polaris, a star we call Dhruva in India, and it is tracing a slow circle path in the sky that takes about 26,000 years to complete. So this is called the precession cycle, and the precession cycle we understand is happening because of gravitational action of the sun, the moon, and perhaps to a lesser extent Jupiter. And that's why Earth is precessing. Because of this precession, the star that would be at a cardinal point of astronomy will change over time. Because we know the precision rate, we can work backwards in time rather precisely and say when a certain measurement or observation might have been done. This is the basis of Indian archeo-astronomy. So Indian astronomy was encountered by the three gentle who came to Pondicherry, East Coast, 1768. Euler, Bailey, Playfair, Samuel Davis. They wrote accounts of Indian astronomy that wowed them. Basically, they were saying, "My goodness, this is amazing! The antiquity seen here and everything and so on." Then came William Jones, from where the controversy started because the linguistic theory started. Once the linguistic theory starts, we see everybody I put in red over here started saying Indian astronomy is bogus because of the antiquity seen over there. So all their works went towards discrediting Indian astronomy. So William Jones, John Bentley, then we have a couple of white names over here. Colebrook. Colebrook was a scholar of Sanskrit who translated works on algebra by Indian mathematicians into English. He also worked a lot on astronomy, and he contested the accounts of Bentley, saying that Bentley is completely wrong. And their feud can be seen even today in Royal Society proceedings. You can see those things. Burgess was a person who was a missionary. Nevertheless, he translated Surya Siddhanta and he found that amazing antiquity. However, he was prevailed upon by his editor, who was this person, Whitney, who wanted to show that Indian astronomy is inferior to Greek astronomy. In doing so, certain kind of narrations came into his translations. And later on, German Weber, Max Müller, Thibaut, and others came in a similar vein. Jacobi, once again, a person who went against the tide saying, no, this is not correct. Indian astronomy is pretty old and so on. Then in today's American Indology, Nuge Power, David Pingree, who have continued in this old line. And so the controversies today are, how old is Indian astronomy? Where did Indian astronomy originate? And perhaps in a feat of amazing audacity, they say that if we don't know something about Greek astronomy, we can recover it from Indian astronomy. This was a position put forward by Pingree, who was a professor in New York University, who put forward that notion. So they said, what did Indians learn from the Greeks? So they predispose it that Indians learned from the Greeks, or what did they learn from the Babylonians? So unfortunately, Indian astronomy shows much greater antiquity than suggested by linguistics. That is why all these reds come over here. So what is the Indian astronomical model? It is one of nakshatras and Rashi. So nakshatras are collections of stars or single point stars and so on. What the Indians observed is every day the moon is appearing over the eastern horizon slightly offset in time than the previous day. So they observed that it takes 27 days approximately for the moon to come back to the same backdrop of stars. So they divided the ecliptic into 27 segments of 13 and 1/3 degrees each. And they identified each of those segments by the principal brightest star or a collection of stars in that place. And for the mnemonics, they anthropomorphized the stories as having Chandra, which is moon, having married 27 daughters of King Daksha. So each of the nakshatras was given the name of one of moon's wives. And the stories embedded in the metaphors over there would enable them to remember what nakshatra comes after what, and some stories regarding that will help in understanding that. So that is what you see here. Chitra, Vishaka, Jeshta, all these things on the outside are the names of the nakshatra. Indians also had the notion of lunar month. The notion of lunar month was, if the full moon appears in the Chitra nakshatra, that month is called the Chaitra Masa. Masa means a month. Some parts of India, they took the full moon. Some parts of India, they took the new moon. If it is, that's why you see this offset in some parts of India by about 15 days over here. They also had the notion of the solar month. So to keep track of the sun's movements, they had the Rashi. The Rashi is familiar to Westerners as the zodiac. So they divided that into 30-degree segments and 12 of them. And these are the names in the Indian context over here. So Indians had a lunisolar calendar, and this was used to mark the passage of time. And the names of the nakshatra are there in two of the ancient Indian books, the Vedanga Jyotisha and the Surya Siddhanta, and the names match for the most part. And when the British came, they tried to identify what these nakshatras are in relation to the names they are familiar with. So Kritika, which is the Pleiades, which is Eta Tauri. Rohini is Aldebaran, which is Alpha Tauri, and so on. So you see these names over here. So I'd like to focus now on the antiquity of the book called Vedanga Jyotisha. So many people try to fix the antiquity of this book by astronomical calculations that are present inside this particular work. And some people like Weber, who said 500 BC, William Jones, 1100 BC, and Colebrook, 1381 BC, and so on. Several people try to understand this. It turns out that this book, Vedanga Jyotisha, is talking about winter solstice happening at Dhanishta Nakshatra. Dhanishta Nakshatra can be identified with Beta Delphini. So you can crank back in time. This circle that you see here is a precision circle. This is today we are pointing at Polaris. If you think of this as the axis of rotation, then this is the circle that it traces in the sky. So in 1440 BC, observe Polaris is nowhere over here. And Dhanishta is this entity that is over here. And the sun is at the solstice position over here. How do we know solstice position? If this is 90 degrees, 90, 80, 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, 0. This is celestial equator, minus 10, minus 20, approximately minus 24. So sun is at the winter solstice position, and it is in the Dhanishta Nakshatra, dated to 1440 BCE. That fixes the date of this particular work. Another work done by a rishi called Yajnavalkya. He wrote a work called Shatapatha Brahmana, which was a manual for the Vedic practitioner on how to perform the rituals, how to find the east direction. One might think this is so trivial. What do you mean finding the east direction? See where the sun is rising, that is east direction. Unfortunately, the sun is tracing a path from minus 24 to plus 24 degrees over a course of 6 months. So where is the east direction? Is it here, 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 and here? Well, the sun is exactly in the true east on the day when it is on the celestial equator. It is there in the celestial equator on the day of the equinox. So in Shatapatha Brahmana, Rishi Yajnavalkya makes a cryptic statement. He says, Kritika, which is the Pleiades, never swerves from the east direction. Therefore, to identify east, you look at the heliacal rising of Kritika. So the Vedic practitioner would wake up before dawn. This is the horizon line, by the way. He'd come and look at the heliacal rising of Kritika. He knows that is the east direction. And about half an hour or 1 hour later, the sun rises and Kritika is washed out. But you know the east direction. And you light your Vedic fires under that. That was the idea. And this turns out to be 15th April 2982 BCE by cranking it back in the astronomical planetarium software. So amazing date over here. There is an ancient epoch encoded in many, many tables in India. So the Puranas talk about something called Kali Yuga. Aryabhatta, who is one of the famous Indian astronomers, and the book Surya Siddhanta, a book of enormous antiquity of Indian mathematics and astronomy, also refer to this epoch. Then other works, Pulisa Siddhanta, a mathematician Brahmagupta, Al-Biruni, a Muslim scholar who came to India, they all refer to this epoch. A temple in southern India, epigraphy, that refers to this epoch. Cassini obtained certain tables called Siam tables. These were got by French travelers who went to Thailand, obtained certain astronomical tables. They couldn't make sense out of it. They sent it out to Cassini in Italy to analyze that. And Cassini observed that it has got the longitude of Benares, Varanasi, as well as the longitude of Ujjain, east and the west of India. It's got those meridians over there, and it's also talking about a certain absolute marker in the calendar. And he determined the epoch on February 18th, 3102 BCE. Later, Playfair, Bentley, Colebrook, Burgess, all of them studied that as referred to in Surya Siddhanta, also referring to the same time frame. And this turns out to be a rare conjunction of planet, sun, and moon in what we call the Revati Nakshatra. So I cranked back in the planetarium software, and it turns out that Revati Nakshatra is here. Revati is Eta Pisceum, by the way. Revati Nakshatra is over here. This is the ecliptic. And we see that Guru is Jupiter, Shukran is Venus, Chandra is the moon, And Mangala is Mars, Surya is the Sun, Buddhan is Mercury, Shani is Saturn. They're all clustered around this place. Such a clustering in Revati Nakshatra has not happened, to my knowledge, in the last 26,000 years. This is the only time when this happened. There was another clustering, but in a different star constellation. That was in 6000 BCE. But in 3100 BC, this is the only one that happened. And this is referred to. This caused great angst for the colonials, who said, how can India have chronological dates that go past the Masonic calendar, past the Masonic calendar, past the Masonic calendars, Noah's sons, the gods in Hindu texts? She's supposed to be with a co-sister, married Kashyapa, and got the Adityas, Rudras, and Vasus. The important thing about Aditi is that she's associated with the nakshatra Punarvashu. And in this particular translation by Martin Hogg of this particular book, Aitreya Brahmana, which comes from the Rig Veda, there is a strange passage over here. This says the sacrifice, the mystical sacrifice personage, went away from the gods. The gods were unable to perform any further ceremony. They did not know where it had gone to. They said to Aditi, let us know the sacrifice through thee. Aditi said, let it be so. But I will choose a bone from you. They said, choose. And she chose this bone. All sacrifices shall commence with me and end with me. This cryptic passage can be understood in the context of ancient Indians struggling to make sense of the celestial calendar over thousands of years, when precision effects change when the year begins and when the year ends. So an era has ended when they are no longer able to figure out when should I do my religious sacrifice or other such things. They don't know. So the reference to Aditi here is the resetting of the calendar to Aditi. And what is Aditi? We're going to see that in the next one. This refers to the vernal equinox. The beginning of the new year in India is always the vernal equinox with the Punarvashu Nakshatra. Punarvashu Nakshatra is the one identified with Diti and Arundhati. These are the two stars identified with it. And this in the Greek tradition is called Castor and Pollux. So Castor and Pollux are these two giants that you see over here. And this is Diti and Arundhati in the, Diti and Aditi in the Indian tradition, or the Punarvashu Nakshatra. The fact that Aditi says sacrifices will begin and end with me, says a year will begin with me and end with me. That refers to this particular issue. When the sun is in the vernal equinox, that can be dated to a staggering 6000 BCE. Going forward, Surya Siddhanta, by the Burgess translation, it has got a reference where the planets have all conjunction in the first of Aries, or the Mesha Rashi, or the Aries zodiacal sign. So this can be again cranked back in the planetarium software Stellarium over here, and I can date this back to 6779 BCE is when this particular great conjunction was observed and remarked in this particular text. There are also stories about Ashwinis. Ashwinis are the offspring in the hagiography of Indian Puranas and on Surya of sun, and refers to the sons or the twin sons of the sun. So it refers to stories. Remember, in India, stories communicate metaphorical wisdom. And over here, it says in the story that the Ashwinis were born in the winter solstice time. They appear with sun, their father, at dawn for heliacal rising. So this winter solstice, the fact that it is a winter solstice is there because it is a cold time, and sun is the winter solstice at this point, and the star here is Ashwini. Ashwini is Beta Arietis. This can be dated back to 7200 BCE. This is referred to by Balagangadhar Tilak and Professor Abhyankar. They refer to this phenomena. Swati is a star we refer to as Arcturus in the Greek tradition. And there's a reference to Swati in the Surya Siddhanta. If you want to identify where Arcturus is, you see the big dipper called Saptarishi, and the tail of that points to Swati or Arcturus. That's how you identify where it is. And it turns out that along with a star called Bernard, Swati is one of the fastest stars in something that we call proper motion. All stars in the solar system are going around the galactic center. It takes around 230 million years to complete one galactic year, if you will. And they've got a three-dimensional velocity: radial velocity, space velocity, transverse velocity. But we can't measure these things. All we can do is, from a reference point, how much has the angle changed? And that angle is called the angle of proper motion. Swati has got 2 arc seconds a year. The Greeks have also recorded Arcturus. If you look at the Greek position of Arcturus, it is off by 1 degree compared with today. That way we can date the Greek records of 1800 years before present. Surya Siddhanta's observation is 6 degrees off compared with where we are today. And that works out to 6 times 60 times 60 by 2, around 8000 BCE. This too is recorded as one of the ancient observations over here. So we can do a rebuttal to Aryan invasion theory. Many instances of interest are dated with astronomical observations. The date of Kali Yuga 3102 BC shows a Vedic concept in place much earlier than the alleged Aryan migrations. Dates preserved in the Vedas, Brahmanas, Upanishads via astronomy are showing great antiquity. We can ask this question: how are these concepts in place in India much before the so-called Aryan invasion of 1500 BCE? Can rebut Max Muller over here. Max Muller, using linguistic analysis, he stuffed all of the Indian works into periodizations that he called Chandas, Mantra, Brahmana, Sutra. 1200 BC to 1000 BC, he said earliest books of Rig Veda. Mantra period in this time frame, remaining books. Brahmana period, when these works, Upanishads were created, 800 to 600 BC. Sutra period, where all this Vedanga, Jyotisha and other such things were done, 200 BCE. But then we have seen Colebrook, he himself said Vedanga Jyotisha is 1400 BC. Where is 1400 BC and where is the Sutra period where Max Muller said it was done? There's no relation at all. Shatapatha Brahmana said Pleiades is in 2982 BC. Where is that in the Max Muller's linguistic Brahmana period over here? Aditi and Ashwini appear in the Rig Veda stories. They appear in 6000 and 7200 BC by an oral tradition. And where is that and where is this Chandas period that Max Muller is talking about? So clearly we have a problem here. How did Max Muller respond to this? He was criticized by his fellow Europeans in one place where somebody asked him, Mr. Max Muller, should all of Indian chronology be held hostage to biblical chronology? This man got so upset by that question that he wrote his entire book on ancient Hindu astronomy and chronology, in which he only accepted Colebrook, fellow Europeans' time frame of 1400 BC for Vedanga Jyotisha, and he discarded all the other works saying they're unreliable. I'm not going to accept those dates. All the Indian works are unreliable. He set into motion a way of thinking about Indian texts to discard them as not reliable, and such views are flaunted today even by several Indian scholars who belong to the persuasions I talked about earlier. This is a clear example of confirmation bias. In confirmation bias, you have your beliefs, 1500 BC Aryans, linguistic analysis. You'll only believe this evidence because Colebrook said 1400 BC is after 1500 BC. You accept that, nothing else. You ignore all the other facts and evidence as unreliable. It's a failed methodology over here. So vast antiquity means the civilization must have had time to accumulate knowledge. Is there evidence of that? Is there evidence of knowledge in the Indian tradition? Traditionally, the knowledge sources have been the Shruti and the Smriti, that which is heard and that which is remembered. Heard is another way of saying it's an oral tradition. The Vedas, Samhitas, Brahmanas, Aranyakas, Upanishads, deep works of philosophies and prayers and other such things have been for a very, very long time. Smriti include the 6 Vedangas, grammar, meter, astronomy, rituals, the epics, Ramayana, Mahabharata, texts on dharma, artha, kama, moksha. The very famous Kama Sutra comes over here. The Puranas, history, encyclopedic works, poetic works, bhashyas, sutras, shastras, various schools of philosophy, politics, medicine, culture, arts, artisan knowledge systems, a whole lot of knowledge systems that were in ancient India. Anybody could find intellectual fulfillment within the framework of ideas that existed in ancient India. So if you look at epistemology, one must always go to epistemology to see, did you have a knowledge system and what was the basis for that knowledge system? These schools at present, The Nyaya school, a one-liner from the school, all knowledge is not intrinsically valid. Most knowledge is not valid unless it is proven. Truth exists whether human beings know it or not. And the rishi called Akshapada Gautama, he was the one who propounded these truths over there. Yoga, today most people only know a series of stretching exercises or breathing and such things, but yoga is much bigger than that. Ashtanga yoga was codified by Patanjali, yamas, niyama, and all of these things. Vaisheshika with Rishi Kanada, which propounded perception and inference as primary means of finding truth. Samkhya Rishi Kapila, which worked on systematic enumeration of the facts and rational examination. That is the thought, investigation, examination, and discussion. And we have Vedanta today with 10 schools are present today with Adi Shankara for Advaita, and we have Buddhist and Jain works of philosophies, all of these things. So put them in a picture. Pramana is the Indian word for means of knowledge. What is your justification for accepting knowledge? If today you're a PhD student or somebody seeking knowledge, what do? You go to a library. You go to a library, take a journal in your area. If I'm an electrical engineer, I go and take the IEEE journal and I look at the paper and I say, all right, this paper was published by a professor from MIT or in Toronto in some big university over there. And I'm because that's a reputed university, this professor is reputed. On the authority of his theorem proving, I will do my thesis by expanding on that work. So your claim to authority is riding on the coattails of somebody who came ahead of you who's got authority. That is the pramana that we see today. It's also called Shabda Pramana, relying on word of experts. In India, you had this perception, inference, comparison analogy, circumstances, derivation from circumstances, negative proofs, non-perception, and relying on the word of experts. Each of these philosophical schools only differed in what was paramount, what was accepted as acceptable, and what was not taken as acceptable. Samkhya took perception, took inference, took Shabda Pramana. Charvakas, the ancient atheists in the Indian context, they only said perception. If I experience it and if I see it, it is true. And they rejected the Vedas, rejected everything else. Buddhism, it reflects the trials and tribulations of Buddha. It only took perception and inference as valid. It did not take anything else as valid. And similarly, Vaisheshika, perception and inference alone. Then Dvaita, Jainism, Advaita, they all differ only in this pramana. Today, there's a tendency to see Jainism, Buddhism as separate religions, but they're not. It is only in the quest for truth. What is it that you accept as knowledge and what do you not accept as knowledge? So the goal of life in the Indian tradition has been for a long time to seek knowledge itself based upon all of these things. So we are seeing, if you have in our contemporary words, the Indian goal of life was to seek knowledge, that thou shalt seek. So the goal has been to dispel the ignorance about your existence and to gain knowledge. In order to do that, you could take any of these means based upon the sampradaya you're born into or whatever you believe in, meaning the lineage that you're in or whatever you believe in, and you could gain knowledge. This knowledge was knowledge of yourself. That knowledge would come in this lifetime or across multiple lifetimes. That was the ideas over here. So it emphasized the seeking of knowledge as a quest of the civilization. And contemporary world today, you see in Abrahamic thoughts, it is more of thou shalt obey, because the goal of life over here was to obey a divine dictated law. Either it was told by somebody who was a son of God, or somebody who was a prophet who heard an archangel Gabriel who recited the Quran to him, or whatever. But your goal in life is to obey. If you obey this divine dictated law, you'll be admitted in the afterlife to heaven or eternal purgatory in hell. This is the goal of life. And knowledge is immaterial in that sense, because the whole goal of life is this. And we see that science flourished in ancient India because of the epistemology. That was one of seeking knowledge. There was no blasphemy. There was no question of persecution because of knowledge. There was no question of separate out science and religion. No such kind of things at all over here. As long as ancient Greece had contact with India, they too had science. However, from 325 current era, we are seeing after the Nicene conference, we are seeing that Europe fell into dark ages. and irrationality until the period of enlightenment and rationalism, 16th to 18th centuries. We are seeing that was a trajectory followed. So it's a very stark reminder. If you look at epistemology, you can say a lot about what happens in history. What are the antiquities of some of these philosophical schools? So we're seeing that Kapila, Samkhya's mentioned Rig Veda. It had an impact on Buddha. So it is the most ancient one. I'm not put a date over here because you saw in astronomy, we saw dates of 8000 BC, 7000 BC. I don't know the date. It's very ancient. So I'm just put the date of Rig Veda period over here. After that, we are seeing that Rishi Kanada, Vaisheshika, he is mentioning Samkhya. Therefore, Vaisheshika is after Samkhya, and Mimamsa. Mimamsa also, he is mentioning that, so it comes after that. But Rishi Kanada does not mention Buddhism. The West has dated into 600 BCE, but Buddha in the Puranas, internal evidence, is 1800 BCE. Therefore, Vaisheshika must be even before Buddha himself. Then we are seeing that if Buddha is here, Nyaya is here, Vaisheshika, Mimamsa, Samkhya. So this gives an idea of the antiquity of philosophical schools that sought knowledge. In this epistemology, pratyaksha or perception was of two kinds, external or internal. External arises from the senses and our interaction with worldly objects. This analysis and understanding through the touch, smell, eyesight, hearing, all those kind of things, that gives you some kind of perception. Internal is one knowing through the mind. And anumana is inference, which is reaching a new conclusion and truth from observations and previous truths by applying reason. So Rishi Kanada, he says to understand Brahman, you understand the natural world, 9 classes of reality, infinity, creation is made up of atoms, Atman, which is, you can't translate it as a soul, but Atman pervades material, 7 classes of experience, substance, all of these things, the particularity and other such things. There's a Professor Subhash Kak has also shown that Vaisheshika's sutra has also enumerated the laws of motion. We can't understand it in the language of today, but you can certainly see the ideas encoded over there. On the other hand, I'm bringing in a name over here. Later on, we'll make the connection. Democritus in 400 BC in Thrace. He is referred to in as the father of modern science. This is a typical of the Western tradition, which exalts figures from its history as having done these things. In this case, the father of modern science. He is known to have traveled to Asia, India, Ethiopia, returned to Greece with something called natural philosophy, in which he said creation is made up of atoms and different types that degenerate, 2 types of knowing, legitimate with intellect and illegitimate with sense objects. And Earth is a sphere, universe is made up of atoms and chaos colliding to make bigger worlds. You're seeing a complete echo of Vaisheshika in what Democritus has outlined. Keep this in mind as we go further. And one more, Yajnavalkya, we dated him by Pleiades and Kritika to 3000 BCE. And in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, he outlines Ashatamo Satkamaya, Tamasamo Jyotirgamaya, Buddhyoma Ramutam Gamaya. From ignorance lead me to truth, darkness lead me to light, death lead me to immortality, peace. So it's a civilization that exalted seeking the truth as the goal of life over here. One might ask, all right, can we take a look at the contemporary world at that time frame? What was the kind of knowledge systems that was there? And there's quite a bit of it. If you look at the epistemology in Egypt at the time, it referred to religious entities as reference to abstract ideas. The metaphorical ideas we see in India are present in Egypt in addition. Egypt, however, had a rigid way of practicing knowledge. They seem to seek answers within an established religious tradition, meaning that it is not an inventive culture, but enforcing that society follows rules and obeys. This is the way of doing things. They upheld writing. Writing was very, very important, and they were syncretic. They were very inclusive in their thought. They did not persecute people for their beliefs. And we are seeing a social pyramid, the pharaoh, the government officials, soldiers, and the scribes were very important, merchants, craftsmen, and others. And Egypt has got a long history that we know from early dynastic Old Kingdom onto the late period and so on. I will not say anything more. There's a lot to talk about this. Mesopotamia is a big word, and that has a lot of dynasties over there. The Akkadians, the old Babylonians, the Assyrians, and going on to Neo-Babylonia, Persians, Hellenistic, all the way to Sasanian. And we are seeing in that society also the king, nobility, priests, scribes, a very similar kind of makeup of that society. And we're also seeing in their epistemology, imagination, process of clarifying randomness found in nature. How do you make sense of phenomena in nature? Imagination. And the deductive logic, find causal relationships, logic and causal relationships, and observation, calibrated set of data. So clearly we are seeing this Vaisheshika kind of idea over here. They also had in New Babylon, not the old Babylon, but New Babylon, that the more mathematical a discipline is, the more scientific it is. So they had a mathematical description. The Chinese, we are seeing a very similar set of ideas to India, and it's not surprising. They were in cultural contact for a long time through Buddhism and Silk Route and other such things. So you see understanding of the Veda connected. There's no separation, creator, creation, and all those kind of things. About heart, mind, that is crucial part of self-awareness. That knowledge, means of knowledge, is an important element of human existence. Then the three pillars in that civilization are Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. And we're seeing several dynasties in China over many periods of time. Need not go into detail over here, but what we're seeing is how Chinese knowledge also evolved because of the reliance on perception, inference, understanding the world. Same thing that we saw in the Babylonian culture also, trying to make sense out of nature logically and other such things. What about Greek epistemology? Greek epistemology, we see the big three: Socrates, who thought Plato, and Plato, who thought Aristotle. These are the big greats of the Greek epistemology. And Socrates, who formed various academy at Plato, he formed this academy to teach Plato's works. He wrote those things and led to Aristotelism and later on, and several other schools that were born out of that. If we look at Plato's thought, we can say Plato's the one who wrote down Socrates' work. So we can start everything with Plato in a sense. So he says knowledge is obtained from senses, knowledge of objects, colors, taste, touch. But he does not consider that as real knowledge. That's very, very important, that these are the illegitimate in a sense. Opinion regarding any object, but this knowledge cannot be relied upon as views of every person differs gathering the same object. Knowledge through mind or wisdom is the highest degree of knowledge, including virtues like truth, goodness, and beauty. So clearly we're seeing Vaisheshika over here, perception, inference, the kinds of knowing that I talked about. We're seeing that in Greek epistemology. So having taken a look at that, I'd like to quickly talk about the roots of knowledge systems and conclude this talk soon after. If we look at the roots of medicine, today's medicine, the roots in a sense go all the way back to the Atharva Veda. Atharva Veda has got a combination of medical procedures as well as spells. They saw spells and medical procedures as means to cure, and this led to the Indian science of Ayurveda. And we see great compendiums called Charaka Samhita and Shushruta Samhita. These are encyclopedic works on the medical knowledge systems. We are seeing from 2000 BC onwards, the Mitannis, the Hittites, the Egyptians, and Chinese are influenced by knowledge systems that appear to have come from here. I say this on the basis of investigating things like the Ebers Papyrus, by looking at the Nippur archives and other works, and trying to see the commonality of knowledge systems here and there, and by looking at the migrations out of India during the multi-century drought in 2000 BCE. It's soon after that that you find knowledge over here in Egypt, for example, Ebers Papyrus, Moscow Papyrus, Smith Papyrus, Cahoon Papyrus. All these things are coming between the periods 1800 BC to 1500 BC. Prior to that, you don't find any, no works at all. So this is an instance of knowledge getting percolated over here. We're also finding medieval Europe dependent on drugs from India. For example, if you see the works of Dioscorides, who wrote a work in Materia Medica that was used in Europe for more than 16 centuries. He wrote during the time of Indo-Roman trade, and we understand that much of those works depended on drugs from India. Arab medicine is based on Ayurveda. Since Bin Qasim's invasion of Sindh that happened in 711 current era, we are finding that Indian works are translated into this Arabic works and used there. And this formed the corpus of European knowledge all the way through the colonial era. Ayurveda was taught in India in the British medical schools till 1880. after such time when chemical knowledge had grown sufficiently in Europe, as well as penicillin and other antibiotics and vaccines were discovered much after the discovery in other part of the world, they stopped teaching Ayurveda. This formed till then as a core pharmaceutical methods. Mathematics, we can show the origins are in the Vedas, number systems, large numbers, operations. In Harappa, we see standardization of measures, geometry, principles. Baudhayana showing greatly refined knowledge of geometry, square roots. Bakshali manuscript with algebra, solution of equations. Aryabhatta with greatly refined trigonometry, spherical geometry, algebra. We are talking Aryabhatta around 500 current era. Bakshali manuscript is around 100 current era. Baudhayana has to be dated to the time of Kalibangan, which is 2500 BCE. Harappa, we know 3000 BCE and on. Vedas, just go back in time. I don't know when. But Suri Siddhanta it's a collection over time. It is not a book written by one person at a given point in time, but it shows evidence of an accumulation over large periods of time. It is showing intricate math, astronomical knowledge, referring to several extinct books on mathematics that are no longer there. Brahmagupta, Bhaskara 1 and 2, these are great mathematicians in India. Brahmagupta around the 7th century, Bhaskara 1 around 600 current era, Bhaskara 2 around 1100 current era. Greatly added to corpus of works on algebra, positional math, zero, functional approximation, value of pi, and all those things. Kerala School of Math between 1300 current era till around 1500 current era greatly refined astronomical models and developed the essence of calculus. If you study calculus, you always study limits and the convergence of functions and other such things. All these infinite series and everything is there in the Kerala School of Math. And Ramanujam, who we know, who lived in the early part of 1900s, he continued this tradition of Indian mathematicians with deep knowledge in infinite series. Astronomy, we see initially Indian knowledge astronomical knowledge is embedded in stories such as the moon married 27 daughters of King Daksha and things of that nature. So they encode astronomical wisdom in stories and metaphors. Then the heliocentric model is encoded in the Shatapatha Brahmana, which we dated to 3000 BCE, Aitreya Brahmana, which is even more ancient. Later, whatever transmission routes, we find that the next mention of heliocentrism comes from Aristarchus. And prior to Aristarchus, also there's a Greek, I forget his name, he also mentioned that. Copernicus, for example, refers to them in an unpublished work of what he did. This gave way to Siddhantic. Siddhantic means mathematical astronomy. Many works are lost, we don't have them. Math works were done to models to estimate the course of sun, moon, planets. Trigonometry was developed for this, spherical geometry. This was used by the Greeks. Ptolemy and others, and Almagest and others had chord-based tables. Chord is not right-angled triangle. Right-angled triangle is trigonometry. But if you draw a chord and the tables based on that, that is not trigonometry. So Ptolemy made use of chord tables of what he did. It is in India and Suri Siddhanta we're seeing the right-angled triangle, trigonometry, spherical geometry, and so on. Aryabhatta had models to estimate mathematical models, the duration of eclipse, length of shadows, and estimation of curvature of the earth and precision rate. The 26,000 year phenomenon that I talked about has got a long tradition in India. From 500 BCE, when it was estimated to be 36 arc seconds in a year, all the way down to Brahmagupta, Bhaskara II, who estimated at 50.8 arc seconds a year. The true figure is 50.2 or so arc seconds. We see a partial model for heliocentrism. From the heliocentric model here, we see knowledge has been lost or recovered by the time we come to Nilakanta Somayaji, approximately 1300 current era, Kerala School of Mathematics. He's got a model where it's exactly the same one used by Tycho Brahe later. Copernicus exchanged the position of sun and moon in the known models, influenced by Aristarchus and others. In India itself, centers of learning were destroyed in Islamic invasions. And one of the last great classical Indian astronomers, Pathani, Samantha Chandrasekhar. Through his methods, we understand how ancient Indians would have done these things. He lived in the British times, completely unschooled in British methods or English or any such thing, learned from classical methods only. He got his own methods. He was in deep poverty, but he made his own instruments using bamboo sticks and other such things, made observations, and he corrected the works of the greats like Aryabhatta and others because of precision. Their tables are no longer right. So he corrected all of them and such things. So by looking at his methods, we understand how ancient Indians with naked eye astronomy, they were able to make great advances. Roots of music. Earliest musical systems we are seeing is in Samaveda. We are seeing in Samaveda the three-tonal liturgical music gave way to five-tonal music, to seven-tone, to 12 semitones, to 22 Shruti system. We are seeing an evolution in Chandogya Upanishad and other such works, which date back to very ancient periods of time. The musical intervals were based on something called chord ratios. One question in everybody's mind is, why did music evolve the same in China, in Greece, in India, and other places? Why did everybody for the major scale come upon do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do? Why do you do that? In India, it is sarigama padanisa. Why? Because of where we are, because of notions of consonance and dissonance, or is there something more to it? In the Indian context, these are based on chord, which is chord is based on ropes were used with knots on them to try to estimate ratios and things of that nature. It is based on that. We find Pythagoras, who's alleged to have traveled to India. He used the same ratios. If you look at the works that compare Pythagorean known music to the tonal ratios, it's the same ratio, and he's known as the originator of the Western music traditions. He used this ratio for music, initially considered it for divine purposes only, not for entertainment. A similar notion in India, music was for divine purposes, not for entertainment. And he's known to have erected a statue for the goddess of music, Muses, in his hometown. Whereas in India, the music was for goddess Saraswati, the goddess of learning and music and talent. So very, very interesting to see similarities, how there appears to be a connection at some deep point in time. Even the modern systems, everything including the communication we're using today, digital electronics and so on, they all owe their existence to something called logic gates. The AND gate, the NOT gate, NAND, OR, and so on, that works on something that today we call Boolean algebra. So these are the two grades every electrical engineer learns about them, De Morgan and George Everest Boole. They're the ones, Colonial era, who developed Boolean algebra. That is the basis for every IC design, optimization, implementation, working, programming, everything based on these things. So the roots of these things are in Nasadiya Sutta and Rig Veda, which starts with A and not A. Ancient Indian Pingala, who wrote Chanda Shastra, he worked on combinatorics. The famous binomial theorem can be seen in very, very ancient works over here in Chanda Shastra. Colebrook, remember he was the person who translated many works in Indian mathematics. He wrote a work on Indian logic in 1824, and this influenced George Boole and De Morgan. How do we know about this? Because George Boole's wife, Mary Everest Boole, she wrote a letter to an Indian scientist called Bose, Jagdish Chandra Bose, in 1901. And she said in detail how Indian logic had a great influence on Boole and De Morgan. So we are seeing a connected tradition of thought. It is not an independent thought that came somewhere, but over time, through time, through space, we are seeing that there is a connection of knowledge systems leading us to where we are today. And there is evidence of universities in ancient India, not one, not two. We are told that most of the universities are Oxford and these ancient European universities. In ancient India, there were many, many more, going back to a very ancient period of time. Most people only know Takshashila and Nalanda, but there were many of them and for a long time. And there are books that have been written that outline these things. All these were erased out during the Islamic invasions and so on. There's one more angle that I pursue over here, which is how did this knowledge, was it in isolation or did it spread out of India? So people often ask, if it went out of India, what are the time frames, who are the actors, what evidence do we have, and so on. I've collected a lot of evidence, and there's not enough time in this talk to talk about all of them. So I've summarized these things, the routes for knowledge transfer. We have noted ancient migrations in genetics itself. And during that time, when we see the technologies that the migrants took that are present in artifacts recovered from various parts of the world, going back to 30,000 years and so on, we can have an understanding of ancient technologies of the past, including ancient religion. If you look at the shamanistic practice, All over the world, you find a common shaman religion, whether you go to Siberia, whether you go to North America, South America, whether you go to Korea, Japan, China, including in old Europe, in Czechoslovakia, and places like that, we are finding evidence of a common shaman culture. It involves beating of drums, smoking of drugs to get into a state of mind, conferring with the spirit world, animal spirits, and so on, curing people by these kind of methods. And this is a common thing. You find everywhere these common elements are there, which hints a common origin. And we find that even today in India, in the tantrics who are there in India, that's there. So I'm calling out some common ideas that would have gone out during the migration period and evolved over time. We finding ancient ports, Pumpuhar, like I said, 15,000 years ago in the Bay of Bengal, submerged about a depth of 125 meters. We're finding ports over there. Lothal, where Harappa is, 5,000 years ago, we find ports over there, marine activity, Harappa, and so on. There are trade. Vedic records of migration to the west. The Drihyu are a tribe following a battle that they went out of northwest India. That's what we are told, but we don't know the extent to which they went. So that is a record of migration. Then we are seeing in Indus Saraswati climate change induced migration in 2000 BC, a 200-year monsoon failure that resulted in an outward migration to the Fertile Crescent, where the Tigris, Euphrates, Nile Valley is. They landed up over there and contributed to those cultures there. And evidence we're finding the Mitannis, Hittites, Elamites, Canaanites, Babylonians, and other contacts, including in the Old Testament. If one were to read the Old Testament, you find Yahweh is commanding the Semitic people to battle some of these ancient people. The Jebusites and other such things can be identified with Mitannis and other people. So they were battling some of these people over there. Mycenaean period of Greeks, even then we are seeing commonality of stories in the Greek tradition, the Indian tradition, as well as artifacts recovered from Crete, the island of Crete, in the Mycenaean culture, the Minoan culture, sorry, where they recovered palaces over there. The frescoes on those walls seem to show langur, the Indian monkey over there, not present in Greece, but somehow it is over there. So evidence of contact is there. We also know of travel by Greek scholars, Pythagoras, Democritus, Pyrrho, and Skylax, and many others who did this. So all the way from 50,000 years ago to 300 BCE, a very big time frame there. Other route for knowledge transfer is after Alexander. Alexander is supposed to have come up to Balochistan in Pakistan. And after him, there were a bunch of Greek kingdoms that his generals ruled. We see the Seleucid Empire stretching all the way from India to Mediterranean lands, and this formed a conduit for knowledge transfers between 300 BC to 100 BCE. Then the Silk Road. Silk Road was an informal trade network from China, Southeast Asia, India, Central Asia, Mediterranean lands, and so on. And one example is the Boer manuscript. The Boer manuscript is one of the most ancient documents we have existing of Indian medicine. It is found in Xinjiang province in China, and it is written in the Gupta script, Indian script, written in Indian script. It contains Indian medical texts basically translated over there and carried forward. The fact that Indian texts were found on the Silk Route tells me that knowledge is also being transmitted in this route, 300 BCE to the medieval period. Excuse me. Then we're seeing the periplus of the Erythraean Sea during the Indo-Roman trade time. So the Greeks initially had trade with India. The Greek civilization fell in 146 BCE to the Romans, and the Romans were in the ascendancy after that. The Romans continued this trade with India, and we get our knowledge from this document called Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is a port sailors document that says where are the ports in the west coast of India, east coast of India for Roman sailors to do their trade in. They would come from Mediterranean lands to Alexandria over here, cross this land bridge by caravans, and come here to this Red Sea, and ships would be waiting here, Indian ships presumably will be waiting here, that would take them all the way to these places, and by the return monsoons they go here and go back. So this is the trade route that we understand, and a lot of knowledge too went through these trade routes, as we've seen in the works of Dioscorides and many other people. The fifth route for knowledge transmission is the Islamic period. So India was invaded by the Islamics in 711 current era when bin Qasim conquered this part of India. And this became part of the Abbasid Caliphate. And that time, the Muslim empire stretched all the way from this part of India, Afghanistan, Persia, all of Arabia, Egypt, and Morocco, and Tunisia, Algeria, all the way to southern Spain. So Indian knowledge was taken from here, translated in Baghdad, and we have evidence of that through Muslim records itself, that many Sanskrit works like Brahmasputa Siddhanta, things like Charaka Samhita, things like Sushruta Samhita, these were translated into Arabic. These Arabic works are pushed into all these places up to Spain, and in Spain they were translated at Toledo into Latin. We know about all of these things. Between 700 BC current era up to 600 current era, Islamics were taking various Indian knowledge systems to these parts of the world. The sixth route is Europeans. They were European church travelers from 10th century to 19th century. One example, Marco Polo, Jordanus of Catalani, and many other people were coming to India taking knowledge. We had translation schools in Toledo, Arabic to Latin, and we have one name from the past, Gerard of Cremona, who translated Sanskrit books that were translated into Arabic, that were translated into Latin, and injected into Spain prior to the start of the Enlightenment era. So we know that Europe, whose epistemology from the Constantine Christianity onwards was a theocracy, until you come to the modern thought and Enlightenment, it was a theocracy. So they were not allowed to take knowledge. There was no knowledge. The church was controlling their minds. So we are finding that the European nobility would send their sons to Spain to study at the feet of the Moors. Although they were in a state of battle, they were still learning at the feet of the Moors on their knowledge systems. And this percolation continued to happen. We are also seeing that colonialists from 16th century, Portuguese, Dutch, French, British, they directly took knowledge from India. So in this graphic as shown, Indian knowledge initially seeded the Greeks and Romans through travelers, trade, and other such people. And prior to that, one more route is there through Babylon, India's influence on Babylon and its consequent influence on Greeks. India's influence on Hittites and the Mitannis, and the Hittites' consequent influence on the Greeks. So those routes are not mentioned over here, but they're also over here. Then we are seeing that this knowledge is destroyed when Theodosius, the successor of Constantine, he enacted what can be called a Talibanic rage over there, where all the pagan institutions were destroyed in Greece, libraries were destroyed, the temples were destroyed, philosophers were killed. Please do read Catherine Nixie, who talks about some of these things. In Darkening Age, the famous female philosopher Hypatia, she was killed in this time frame. And so we see that knowledge is destroyed in the Roman Empire by these works. However, some of these works survived in the Levant, in places like Lebanon, Syria, and all those places. These knowledge survived, and they were inherited by the Arabs, the Muslims. So they inherited these works. They also got knowledge destructively from India. And some of the greatest Arabic scientists, people like Al-Ghazali, Al-Fazali, Al-Haytham, and others, they ramped up on Greek knowledge and Indian knowledge, and they were able to advance knowledge with their epistemology to a certain extent. And that knowledge also seeded Europe. We know that. And that is what eventually led one of the main factors leading to Enlightenment from there on. So this knowledge injected over there to Europe, this has come back to India today without citations. Because during the Enlightenment period, when, for example, when Europe got control of Spain, that battle was ongoing with Islam for a long time. Finally, Isabella and Ferdinand, with the Pope's help and others, they managed to get all of Spain. They instituted inquisitions. There was inquisitions in Rome, inquisitions in Paris, inquisitions over here. All of these are meant to cleanse the Christian society of these pagan influences, there's more influences, Jewish influences and such things. So many of these European scholars hid their sources. They did not want to say they got knowledge from the Muslims because that was a death sentence typically. So they hid their sources. And we are seeing plagiarism, and that has come back to us without citation. That is what we are seeing today. So in summary, you have prior to 3000 BC migrations, 3000 to 2000 BC Harappa trade with Mesopotamia. We know about this. 2000 BC monsoon failure, migration to Fertile Crescent. 500 to 400 BC Greek travelers who came to India. After Alexander contacts, Roman trade, 100 BC to 300 current era. The Silk Route, which existed for quite some time to to the east as well as to the west. Medieval trade, even after the Byzantine kingdom was flourishing in some sense after the after the Western Roman Empire had fallen, the East was continuing on. Even then, between Syria, Armenia, and Persia, there was land route trade, and we have evidence of that through several works that are maintained in Edessa, in other Antioch, and cities like that. We have knowledge that Indian works were over there and transmitted to. Arabs, 711 current era, Abbasid and others. Muslims from 1000 current era to 1700, translations of works to Arabic, Persian. Colonial era. Colonials did not just come for the gold and spices and control of India, taking the Indian money, but they were also after knowledge. After Cassini had shown the antiquity of Indian works in 1600s, there was a thirst for what else did the Indians know. That was a time of enlightenment in Europe. They were discovering the Greek texts. After the fall of Constantinople, many of the Byzantine scholars had settled in the Western European, I won't call them countries, nationhood was still nebulous over there, in those areas. And they were translating the Greek texts into Latin and other things. They were learning. So colonial people wanted Indian texts too, and we have evidence of that. When the French landed in Tamil Nadu, the first thing they did is found out and got the Indian texts by hook or crook. They'd go to a temple and force the priest over there to part with his books, either by bribing him or by killing him or by forcing him at gunpoint to give away the works. And today, the French Institute of Pondicherry, which is there in Pondicherry today, boasts that it has got the world's largest collection of Shaiva Siddhanta manuals on mathematics and many, many other works. So this is what happened in the colonial era. We know major translations happened to English, German, and French up to present day. Present day, most of the work on quantum mechanics and others have used inspiration from Vedanta for the observer effect. Whether you look at Niels Bohr's works or many other present day people, to understand that observation changes the course of an experiment. The whole idea was taken from the notion of Vedanta itself, the observer effect and the pramanas that we talked about and so on. So we are seeing that transmission of knowledge continues to the present day. What happened in India? It's a logical question. So India had all of these things. We don't find that today. So what happened? Well, genocide and ethnocide, that's what happened. Monotheism, when it came, it was a violent assault on the Indian civilization identity. From 711 current era to around 1700s current era, we had many, many bloodthirsty despots, Bin Qasim, Ghazni, Ghori, Delhi Sultanate, Bahmani Sultanate, the Mughals, Tipu Sultan, Nizam, and many others who in their time, in this time frame, destroyed temples, libraries, institutions, genocide of population, the slavery, including sexual slavery, selling of women in markets, jizya, forced conversion, suppression of identity. It's estimated that 50 million Indians died in this time frame because of these activities. Then when the colonial people came, 1500s to present, then too we're seeing aggression on the Indian civilization. The Goa, the Portuguese had landed over there, Xavier and others, they instituted the Goan Inquisition and destruction of temples. In Tamil Nadu, the destruction of temples by the French. The British practiced ethnocide. I'll talk about that presently. It's estimated that due to the policies of the British, 80 million Indians died between 1760 to 1947 through famine and epidemics. This is a non-issue in European scholarship because obviously it is nothing to do with the white race or other such things. So in any other point in time, one would say 80 million deaths under your watch in famine. That is a horrendous criminal act. But even today, that's not played up. Churchill, for example, is upheld as a war hero in World War II, but Indians who know that history know how murderous he was, how utterly callous in making sure that food crops are diverted from India, which was experiencing famine, to go and support the war effort in World War II. He caustically mentioned, is Gandhi still alive? If Gandhi is still alive, that means Indians are getting food to eat, so send the food over there. This despite his people advising him that Indians are dying of famine, don't send the food outside over here. This is his response. So anyway, we are seeing up to 80 million deaths. This is what happened in India. Ethnocide is practiced by the British. They orchestrated it through 5 mechanisms. One was the creation of widespread poverty. I'll talk about that. destruction of identity through the manufactured caste. I talked about Risley, how they use craniometrics and things like that. India has no idea what caste is. It is a foreign word in India. It is casta of Portuguese that was forced on the Jati Varna system, which was fluid in India. India had a Jati, means hereditary occupation, or a Varna, meaning your disposition. What is your disposition towards certain things? In today's world, if you pass the SAT or other things, then you get, or CAT exam, then you get into certain positions. Your disposition. Are you brainy enough to get into university or medical school? You have entrance exams. In a similar fashion, the Varna was, what is your disposition towards a certain activity? So India had that, and a fluid system had that. This was stratified and enforced as caste by the British. That destroyed the identity and led to great perversions in the society from then till present day. We have destruction of identity through distortion of our history. Like I said, history was perverted by them. Then the destruction of religion, missionary activity. They went through creation of atrocity literature to show that Indians had conflict because of Vedic system. The so-called caste system, the Aryan invasion, about supposed oppressors, the upper caste oppressors, and lead to conversions. So that caused issues. Introduction of English led to a death of Sanskrit and Arabic in the country, which Arabic was also there because of Islam, and that led to a death of those, and that also destroyed our systems. And if you look at the poverty alone, I'm quoting three eyewitnesses, not eyewitnesses, three people who studied, scholars who studied this. Angus Madison is a historical economist. He studies the economy and history, and he goes back to the year one, Common Era, and he's looking at different USA, Western Europe, China, India, Middle East. This is not a linear scale, by the way. Excuse me. So he's saying India was at 33% of the world GDP at the turn of the Common Era, and going down at a certain point. And 1700s, onset of the colonialists, India steeply goes down. At the same time, Western Europe goes up and USA also goes up. So you're seeing a transference of wealth from India into Europe at that particular time. Will Durant wrote this excellent book, Case for India. You can download it and read it from Google. So he had no sympathies for the British. He was an American who came in 1930s to India. He saw what the British had done to India. He was horrified. He was a historian. He knew the history of India, and he was horrified at what British had reduced Indians to in poverty. And he said the British had incurred a national debt in 1792 of $35 million, and by 1901 it was $1 billion. When he left India at 1930, it was $3.5 billion. The exchange rate being in 1930s, what it was in 1930s. After that was World War II. So British used India as the checkbook and bank for just about everything, and that caused enormous poverty in India. Utsa Patnaik, a recent economist, she studied that, and her studies estimate that $45 trillion, astronomical figure, was siphoned out of India by the British over a period of about 100 years or so. So it's amazing some of these numbers that have come out of these. And I've shown that graphically in a linear scale. And this linear scale is showing that in the turn of the Common Era, 33% of the world GDP, India seems to fall by 10% in 1,000 years. That is a slope that we see historically. When the Mughals had taken over in India, we see a steep downfall over here. Then there's a consolidation in around 1700s by the Marathas. It goes up once again. But the British, in their wars with Marathas and Sikhs, they had conquered all of India. And you see a steep downfall in India, all the way from around 25%, it goes down to less than 4%. This accounts for the poverty that we see in India. This is the new India, desperately trying to recover, and this is where we are today. And today, we also find that along with this fall, identities were created. Until that time, Indians were Bharat. They only knew themselves as Bharat. In the Vijayanagar Empire, is propping up and trying to fight the Islamic people in the southern part of India, the word Hindu came in. But when the British came, we became Aryans and Dravidians. And today we have neo-ethnocide happening with new identities. People are like Dravidian and other such things are happening. This is what is going on. So in conclusion, I started this talk with what I called a mainstream narration and evidence-based narration. So I hope I've been able to show that there isn't an Aryan invasion theory. there is an out of India. That is what we are seeing from the evidence. Indic thought did not just impact the East, but also the West. It is not a recent civilization, it is ancient. It did not borrow from the Greeks and Babylonians, rather, it seeded the Greeks and Babylonians. Indians are not Aryans, tribals, and Dravidians. These identities are manufactured. I did not go in detail of the genetic studies over here, but we can do that. I touched upon this that Vedic culture, they say the caste system is responsible for widespread poverty. That's a bogus argument, but it is invasions, especially by the British, responsible for widespread poverty. So, concluding remarks, Indian deep history, I use the word deep history instead of prehistory because there's a reason for that. Deep history taught in schools and universities utterly wrong. 5 agencies have enforced their ideologies and frameworks. They control the historiography of India to the present day. Colonial, Eurocentric, Missionary, Socialist, Academia, and Marxist. Linguistic methodology is upheld to prop up their narratives. Unfortunately, it does not align with evidence from many other fields. We have seen several other data points, does not align there. Therefore, we can falsify them. Antiquity of human presence in India, I've presented a little bit of it through archaeology. Antiquity is seen in the genetic migrations. We saw the mtDNA and the Y chromosomal markers and what they're telling us. We saw astronomy and the antiquity that is seen there. It is not isolated because it is supported by material evidence from archaeology. I showed the radiometric dates from Saraswati civilization going back 9,000 years and so on. So these are not dates just pulled out of nowhere. There is clearly an overlap with the civilization over there. So there's strong evidence to uphold the antiquity of the Indian civilization. Very briefly, I discussed the knowledge systems and epistemology. I showed briefly the impact of Indian learning on ancient, medieval, and modern world through the transmission routes and others. And I also discussed the reason for downfall of the Indian civilization through genocide and ethnocide. And clearly, if we have an evidence-based narration as opposed to an ideology-based narration, we can discredit much of this nonsense that is coming out in the textbooks, which constrains Indian chronology to 1500 BCE. Once we break free from those shackles, then you can see that the internal evidence is going to a pretty ancient period of time. However, to discard that, the British have said your works are unreliable. So that is once again has entrenched many people into, or rather enslaved them into this kind of thinking. All right, that is the end of my talk. You can, if you like this, you can see some of my works on YouTube by searching for Raj Vedam. I can be reached at this email address. I'm on Twitter as well as on Facebook. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing here and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Vedam. That was absolutely extraordinary. And, you know, I was wondering to myself, what is it that gives you the endurance to do what you do? And the amount of productivity, the talks that you give are astounding. It's like you don't feel fatigued. And also the question of courage. What it gives you the courage to say what you're saying, where you know that you're challenging so many fundamentally held sacred structures and beliefs and sacred cows. And I realize in just listening to you here today that you have made a quality of discovery and a way of thinking that you're bringing to humanity, which offers some master keys to liberate thousands, the entire Indian people and beyond, even from thousands of years of fallacies that have kept us from accessing our potential. So I understand it. I mean, this is really divine what you've been able to do. And I thank you so much for doing this and sharing this. In the course of just the last half hour, there's been a lot of people putting their names in queue. I, for one, have a ton of questions. I'll withhold for now. Cynthia was the first to get in a question. And Cynthia, go for it.
Yes, thank you as well. Wonderful and wonderfully impressive, because a lot of people tend to focus in one little specialty of argument, and then it opens it up for all these other angles, and you just annihilated the whole the whole structure that has been undermining the gift of Indian culture, which is such a tragedy. And, you know, it's happened with many other Asian countries and Africa as well. it's a real struggle. And, you know, the British have also played a big hand in the African situation with, you know, taking a lot of the artifacts, putting it in their British museums so that, you know, the people in Africa do not even have access to their own cultural heritage and are told these lies of, you know, what their history is about. And again, this whole pale skin, dark skin thing is something they say to the Africans as well, right? That it was the pale skins that were the most scientifically advanced and so forth. I'm also highly impressed that you pinpointed on the Fabian Society, because I find a lot of people don't understand that aspect, which is very important. Bertrand Russell being a leading Fabian. And I was wondering, you know, with this playing a major role in twisting how Indians now are taught about their own history. Do you know something as well about the Theosophist role? Because oddly enough, the Theosophists with Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant, who is actually a leading spokesperson for the Fabian Society and the Marxist Social Democratic Federation and the Theosophist Society, they in turn taught Hinduism to the Westerners in a very, you know, fallacious, misrepresented manner. And it was like a false kind of spirituality that was skipping a lot of steps and things like that. So it's funny that they're doing this to the Indians in terms of, you know, saying that your culture, your history isn't as far back as it is. And then with the Westerners, they're saying, you know, that you lack the kind of spirituality that Indians have, and then they try to teach this in their corrupt form. I was wondering if you could say something about that. Also, if there are more people like yourself, more scholars like yourself in India that are starting to question what is being taught in the education system in India, and also this idea of the manufactured caste system, because like Brahmin is supposed to be, from my understanding, a spiritual ranking, right? Of like, even if you look at the Plato golden, silver, bronze souls, it's not your social status or your ethnic status, but it's where you are in your learning, in your understanding. And that possibly what the British did is they emphasized it more as a social and an ethnic caste system.
Right. So many questions there. I'll try to remember. Please put me back on track if I go off track over there. So Theosophical Society, Annie Besant and Helena, I can never pronounce her last name, Blavatsky.
Blavatsky.
Yes. So I would think there have been attempts to exoticize the Indian systems in terms of spirituality and other works when they teach back over here. So Annie Besant played a certain role in India during awakening the consciousness of people in trying to uphold the Indian civilization in what it was. At the same time, like you point out, there's a reverse effect happening in the Western civilization. I have not followed their works in any great detail. I only have a nodding acquaintance, so I cannot give you much insight on that particular aspect. On the second aspect, on the Brahmins. So he talked about Brahmins in the society, about how Plato saw about the gold, silver, and other categorizations. In India, it has always been in terms of the Varna. Varna meaning there's a notion, for example, the Bhagavad Gita that says, what is your guna? A guna is a disposition toward a certain kind of activity. Are you drawn towards learning, for example, or are you drawn towards more of material activity, or more towards, you know, the fierce patriotism, want to protect, and those kinds of things, or other things? So the disposition of people, aligning them along that, was what was seen over here. There's no authority saying you shall do this, you shall do that. No such thing was there. It was fairly a fluid kind of system. The Brahmin, by no means was he the power broker in any part of our history. The Brahmin was typically an impoverished person, a person who was literally a beggar. I'm not exaggerating, literally a beggar. We have hundreds of stories in India where the stories always begin. There's a very poor Brahmin who was begging and he got some divine intervention, whatever. So all through history, we see, even in anecdotes over here, these kinds of things. Society required Brahmins to stay poor in return for the respect they would accord them. The thinking over there was, especially in oral transmission times, if you were the custodian of knowledge and you're required to memorize this entire body of work, there were Indians who were called Chaturvedi, meaning you have learned all four Vedas, or Trivedi, three Vedas, or Dvivedi, two Vedas, and so on. So different people could memorize that much and be the repository of that knowledge. Now imagine if you take a scholar and give him all kinds of entertainment, enjoyment, and money, and so on, the chances are your scholarly pursuits will be hijacked by your desire to enjoy pursuits. It's the same psychology in the past also, I presume. So people, Brahmins typically did not have many possessions, very poor, lived on handouts of society. In return, society exalted them, elevated them to, because they were the teachers of society. Indian tradition, what we are seeing repeatedly we are seeing this. Kings would invite these teachers to their kingdoms. Why was that relevant? They would invite them saying, we will give you this village to settle in, you can settle in this village, and so on. Once the Brahmins settled there, they would form something called a village layout with Vastu Shastra. It is called Agraharam, where they were. That form, Vastu Shastra means the loosely where the layout of the town, where what is. So there would be a place where there would be a place where a temple is, a place where the artisans would be there, somewhere else, and so on. The reason for that was the Brahmins would teach the various children of the various other classes about how to ply the trade, whether it was mathematics, whether it was the grammar, whether it was astronomy, and whatever children of artisans would be taught over here. And what is the need for that? India needed an educated workforce to produce, even in cottage industries, the goods that were after the whole world. Why did the Indo-Roman trade happen? Why did the Silk Route happen through India? Because the cotton cloth was in so much of a demand, the muslin and so on. That's why even today you go, the port cities of India are where you find maximum cotton industries. This is from historical times to present times, you find that. So bottom line, by the Brahmins teaching the children of these various other categorizations on mathematics, measurement, and other such things, they were able to help them advance. By teaching the traders' children mathematics, they were able to make them advance in commerce. You can't be a businessman if you can't price your product, if you can't know the exchange between, if you go on the Silk Route, somebody's giving you some gold in his own weight. You need to be able to understand ratios and do things like that. Where is the evidence for that? Evidence is in Bakshali manuscript. Bakshali manuscript was recovered near Peshawar, Pakistan in 1800s, birch bark documents which contain mathematics that it says a Brahmin wrote that on the request of a trader, Vaishya trader, who asked him to help his son learn mathematics. So he says he compiled all the knowledge of that time and helped him. In that, I'm finding methods of algebra, methods of commerce mathematics in terms of how do you calculate interest, how do you price something, how do you sell something, exchange. So amazing works. And as far as the trader, artisan is concerned, how do you measure out your product? How do you do various things? So clearly, by educating the workforce, the entire kingdom prospered. All artisans are able to create quality goods, trade would happen, entire kingdom prospers. This is a model we see repeatedly in ancient India, medieval India, until such time the social dynamics are completely interrupted by ethnocide and genocides. So this, I hope, will explain what the role of the Brahmin was in the society.
Could I also just quickly, so, like with Confucius, it was looking for the philosopher king, right? Mm-hmm. Were Brahmins also looking for the philosopher king, or was it more educating the people? And also, just quickly, are there more scholars in India that are pushing back on this narrative?
Yes. So in India, we find that Brahmins were often appointed as court ministers to help advise the king of Rajya Dharma. Rajya Dharma means what is the right thing for you to do. The right thing depends on the hat you're wearing. If you're wearing the hat of a king, you have a certain role to play over there according Dharma is the natural rhythm of the universe. This is the philosophy of India, just like China. China is also looking for balance within the Tao, within the Zen, and it's looking for the balance over there. Similar kind of ideas were here also. So the Brahmins were appointed as ministers to help advise the king on various aspects of dharma, what he should do in various places. The king would have his own advisors for military, for other things. In fact, there's an ancient book called Arthashastra. Arthashastra was written by Chanakya. Chanakya was the name of the person who wrote it in Magadha, going back maybe 300 BC or so, in that time frame. And that is a compendium on statecraft, a statecraft compendium that talks about a whole lot of things, not just administration, but a lot of other things. From that, we have a contemporary view of what India was like when Magadha made contact with Alexandrian Greek. We know what that society was like. Anyway, that's one part of the question. The other part is, are there other scholars? Yes, there are. There are. India has, like I said, this application of colonial history to India is a new phenomenon. Indians encountered this in the colonial era. And some of the big names in the colonial past, in the Indic side, were people like Bala Gangadhar Tilak. Tilak lived around the turn of 1900s or so. And even prior to him, they're pushing back. They're pushing back, saying, no, this does not gel with our history. These people also had the advantage, they were Sanskrit scholars because they lived in an India where Sanskrit was not entirely erased out. So they had a touch with the traditional learning as well as the British learning coming at that time frame, and they were pushing back. So early era scholars like Tilak and others were there. P.V. Kane, I mentioned that name, K.M. Munshi, Vartak, many others were there. Then in the later time frames, now present time, Europeans who are doing this work, for example, Michel Danino, Conrad Elst from Netherlands. There is several other names, I can't recollect them right away, Kazanas from Greece and others. So there are several other scholars who have seen the reality of some of these things and they are calling this out. There are Russian scholars also doing the same, who are looking at the genetics record, the linguistic record, and they have their own evidence in Central Asia because it's all part of Soviet Union. They have the internal documents in history. So using that knowledge, they're able to push back. So we are finding several people today who are trying to push back. Unfortunately, the government and others still rely on the received wisdom. The expertise simply does not exist to overturn these huge changes. Every time the Indic scholars have come and proposed changes, the response has been to pigeonhole you as a fascist or as somebody who's ideologue, Hindutva ideologue, seeking to have a regime change where you're going to kill all the minorities. These kind of FUDs, fear, uncertainty, doubts, these have been pushed into the discourse today. It is a long tradition set by people like Max Muller. Confronted with chronology, what did he do? He said, these are all unreliable texts. I'm not going to take it. So the same kind of thinking we are seeing here. When people don't want to confront this, they will not address it. They discredit rather than addressing. I have gone record saying academics have to engage. You cannot be a gatekeeper. Gatekeeping is not academics. If you are an expert in your area of work, it is incumbent on you to keep track of advances in your field and write your papers on them. Either you're for it or you're against it, give your ideas, see what is going on. We don't find that engagement, perhaps because the social studies areas are not sciences in the way we know sciences. Sciences are more empirical. We can talk about formulas, methods, what you've done, understand the limitations. This whole field goes by opinions, just by opinions. In India, perhaps as in the rest of the world, archaeologists are perpetually in conflict with historians. Historians believe they are the ones who are qualified to interpret the artifacts and say what is going on. Archaeologists say we are the guys working in the field. We know what we have recovered and what it is telling us. So in India too, although I talked about radiometric dating by archaeologists and finds and others, the history textbooks sadly continue the received wisdom of these 5 frameworks I talked about.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's very good. So many messages of thanks and gratitude. It's really nice to see. The next person on the list that got their name in was Gerald. Jerry, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Vedam. That was amazing. That's like a 4-year university course we got in 2 hours. It was, it'll take me a while. I was actually fortunate because about 30 years ago, a good friend of mine lent me a book called the Aryan, written by
Tilak.
Paul Gangadhar Tilak.
Right.
And I read that. So the whole fight he was having with the dating of how old Indian civilization was. And then when I was told that the British put Tilak in prison because he was agitating for Indian independence, at that point, Tilak became one of my heroes, and everything he said had to be true. So I fell in love with Tilak 30 years ago. And now my question might seem to be coming from way out in left field, but I mean, your whole tour de force shows the influence of Indian culture and knowledge throughout the whole world, except for one place, the Americas. And in America, we have the same fight where the anthropologists refuse to admit a old date for civilizations in America, and anything found before that they disregarded. It doesn't exist. And during your talk, there was a couple times where you mentioned Lothal in Northwest India. And I remember reading about Lothal, I guess it was in the 50s and 60s. I think it was Professor Rao.
Yes.
And when during the excavations, they found some copper. And this copper was 99.9% pure copper with no arsenic in it. And from all the research I've done, there's only one place on earth where you can find in the open copper of that quality, and that's in North America, present-day United States, northern Michigan, northwestern Ontario, Lake Superior. And somehow this copper from North America ends up in Lothal. And I think Professor Rao dated it to about 2500 BC. Now, you may have a correct version. I'm just remembering from years ago. But in all of your immense reading and studying, have you ever seen any kind of evidence of cultural contact, maritime contact, activity, or trade between Indian culture and the cultures of Americas?
Excellent question. It's a difficult question to answer also. So let me first preface from your very first point. Tilak and the Orion, just one point to note is that Tilak was a product of his times. Tilak lived at a time when the linguistic theory was gaining fervor, and people had believed that. That was a time when Datta came and criticized people believing linguistic theory. Tilak purchased the linguistic theory from these people, and he located the Aryans in the North Pole. Antiquity was there, but he located in the North Pole. So it was a partial reflection of the ideas that were enforced by some of the prevalent notions there. So clearly he was not immune to some of those notions. On the second note on copper itself, yes, there is India, Harappa especially, is shown to be a metallurgical society. If you look at the works of Srini Kalyanaraman, who works from Saraswati Research Center in Chennai, in India. He's written many books, monographs on this, where he's calling out the metallurgical society that was there in whole of Harappa, and that is where its wealth was from. And he's shown trade with up to Haifa. Haifa on one side, Vietnam on the other side, with the Harappans were having trade. That is his works based upon several evidences that he's discovered. He's showing that. Third is the contact with the Americas itself, especially the Mesoamerica. We're talking about two Americas here. One is we're talking about the genetics route, the genetics that says during the time of the ice ages, land bridged through the Bering Strait, and that is when through Siberia, Homo sapiens are supposed to come to North America. It could be a disputable theory, but that is what people have measured today with mtDNA and Y chromosomal research. I have pointed out that a shaman culture is common in North and South America, all the way to Chile. You go up to Chile, you find the same culture. If you look in Google pictures for shamans from various parts of the world, you'll find the images are same. They're beating a drum made of animal skin, and they're all smoking drugs. They're conversing animal spirits. So this is one level of commonality that I'm saying might have originated in ancient India, because you find that present in India even today. That same kind of culture is still there among the tantrics. The second is in Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica has thrown up several data points which we can't make sense of today. The Olmecs, the Mayans, and the Incas, the Aztecs. In each of those cultures, we are finding some amount of commonality that hints to some common understanding with India, perhaps even southern India. In the Indian tradition, remember I said that there are several stories that are there in India that it's so ancient we can't make sense out of it. We need to carefully tease out the details and metaphors, if any, out of them. And one of them, the story of Kubera. Kubera is the protector of wealth, if you will, in the society. So he and his followers left southern part of India on the boat and went to Patala. Patala is the other side, if you will. Patala is the understanding of the other side. Some people interpret it as hell. There's no hell in Indian traditions. So he went to Patala. So there are some who say that this marine expedition could have landed up in perhaps in this part of the world, and so on. There are several other people in finding archaeological similarities. His name is Praveen Mohan. Praveen Mohan. If you were to search for him on YouTube, you'll find a number of intriguing videos by him where he's calling out similarities, and the ones with Mesoamerica are particularly interesting. But even before him, there are others who have called out some data points. So at this time, I'm only keeping them as data points. I don't have a theory to connect them. If I were to do that, venture into speculation over here, I would say that the work by Professor Ramaswamy, published last year in Current Science, is talking about Pumpuhar. Pumpuhar, the one I told you, Bay of Bengal, 25 kilometers out, 125 meters depth. There are man-made harbors over there. Harbors and settlements is found over there. And he's speculating there was a marine culture over there. And my question is, 18,000 years ago was the maximum of the last ice age when this would have been visible. Even if you take it as 15,000 years, who were they trading with? Who were these people who might have had what we call catamaran? Catamaran is the same as the logs tied with rope and other such things. Who were they trading with? That is the big question. We don't understand that. Were they trading with Southeast Asian countries? Were they trading even further beyond Polynesia? Were they trading on coastal cities in India itself, hugging the coastline and traveling? Maybe all of these things. Maybe these people also would have explored going outside. So people today, when they try to see the origins of the the Polynesians, they are calling out genetic traces going back to even to the Mauryan Empire time frame. Mauryan Empire is around Alexandrian time frame, 300 BC to 200 BC, in that time frame. They're calling out genetic linkages from that with Southeast Asia, with Taiwan, and going out into these areas. So we don't know the extent of marine trade that would have existed even before the Polynesians over there. It's well possible that maybe there were expeditions that landed up there, and the commonality of culture is showing that. But questions come. This is speculation. Questions come. Why did that contact stop? Why did it not continue? People say the Vikings also landed there much before, and again questions come. Was it an isolated expedition? Were there more people who went there? We don't have answers. No answers. At this point, I'm treating them as data points waiting to be understood.
Okay, thank you very much, Doctor.
The next person up, and just to confirm, Dr. Vedam, you're still okay for time, right?
Yes, I'm okay. We can go on for at least half an hour more.
Okay, all right, great. So John, go for it. Are you still there, John?
I'm here.
Yes.
I just as an initial comment, the Soviets were trying
Can you
to
speak?
develop.
Can you speak up, John, or is there a way to increase your volume?
Volume bracket.
Or just speak loud.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah.
Yes, yes, very clear. Yes, go ahead.
All right, so I'll get rid of these earbuds, and I don't like them anyway. The Soviets were trying to develop a notion of universal history, and the biggest problem they found was Indian chronology.
Surprise, surprise.
And I think if we accept your arguments, we can see why they had difficulties.
Right, right.
Absolutely nothing made sense.
True, 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 true. I would imagine, because astronomy is something that will be difficult to falsify. One can say your interpretation is wrong. One can say maybe these texts were interpolated. You can say many such things, but the question comes, one or two interpolations, yeah, I'll buy that. But I have got literally hundreds of archaeoastronomical observations, all going back to an ancient period of time. That must call for a deep-rooted conspiracy for people to go and change these things. I don't think the technology science is there to do that.
I have reservations with your archeo-astronomy because there's a sort of an implicit assumption that the solar system back several thousand years ago is identical to the solar system today, and that's not necessarily the case because there's many histories of catastrophism in all cultures across the world. But let's put that aside. I visited about 20 years ago the Indian Institute of Information Technology in Hyderabad. It was triple IT, as it was called.
Right.
And then it was a new institution at the time. And so a number of people who, there was a big research center on natural language processing. And I remember talking to the head of the institute there, who was in fact the rector of the university as well. And he was saying, look, yes, if you look at the very core of the languages, you've got these Indo-Aryan languages, as they're called in India, and Dravidian languages. But as far as we're concerned, there's a single Indian language space. And remember, these people were studying the 14 major languages. They weren't just studying one or two languages.
Right.
And this is what you call the Sprachbund. And the thing is that the only significant difference they could find between the Indo-Aryan languages and the Dravidian languages is that Dravidian languages have a more complex system of participles. In Indo-European languages, we only have two, but they have more like something like six. And for people, and the Hyderabad is more or less the border between so people speaking Hindi from Hyderabad, they have workarounds. So they can, they have the standard way of expressing these Dravidian extra participles in their own version of Hindi, which if you go further north, you don't find. And so I thought that was because that's the very first thing you're working with is the linguistic hypothesis. If there's a common language space, that common language, and they are these languages of originally different families, that means that they've been together for so long.
Right.
That they have developed a common vocabulary, a common culture, a common way of thinking, et cetera, et cetera. But the one thing that I wanted to focus on was the actual invasion theory itself. Because the Greek chronology, also thank you to the British, has a Greek invasion theory. And it comes in exactly around the same time as the Aryan invasion theory. Right. It's like people are not allowed to have their own developed history, culture, and so on and so forth. It has to be those bloody invaders from the north.
Sorry, go on.
And I don't really have that much more to say. I did have one more thing. How screwed up chronology affects every aspect of your research. If you accept the standard chronology. So I met this Dutch researcher, his name is Rens van der Slees, and he was looking at the collected mythologies from around the world, starting from the stuff that James Fraser collected in his Golden Bough. And he said that there's these certain themes that appear everywhere around the world. And at the time, Fraser said this is just accidental, but the Rens van der Vlies are saying, no, it's not accidental. It's because they have common, the ancient peoples of the world, they shared the same sky and they saw the same disasters and so on and so forth. But he said all these myths can be ordered, and you can actually, so he had something like 100 myths. But the problem with his ordering is he assumed that the standard chronology provided for the Egyptians and the Indians and the Babylonians and so on and so on, and the Greeks, is correct. And in so doing, I cannot rely at all on the ordering that he comes up with, because he assumed that these chronologies were correct.
Right. So we have very, very good points over there. So I see the same kind of problem in much of the work that I do, because you keep hitting the ceiling, 1500 BCE ceiling. So nothing can go beyond that. It's like it's a received wisdom. You should not question that. The shibboleth kind of thing. Don't question that. It stays over there. So on languages itself, it turns out that Indians never have had this dichotomy that is a Northern Indian, Southern Indian, Aryan, Dravidian. Like I pointed out in one of my slides, several dozens of Indian thinkers and writers from various periods of time. In not a single one of those writings you find this North. When the British came to India, of course, it could be from a position of ignorance, but they thought there is no difference in Indian languages. All Indian languages are derived from Sanskrit. It turned out that there was a Britisher called Campbell who was working in Hyderabad, by the way, in that area. So his mentor was somebody called Ellis White. And Ellis White had worked with some Sanskrit professors in southern part of India who had shown him differences in certain words in something called Panini's word list, differences in Tamil, in southern language, and in Sanskrit. So he proposed that there are perhaps two language families. So when Alexander Campbell wrote a grammar on Telugu, southern language, he invited his mentor Ellis White to write the foreword. Ellis White wrote a 40-page foreword which called out the differences he's seen in the languages over here, proposing there are two language families. So that led to the received wisdom from there on that there is an Aryan set of languages and a Dravidian set of languages. Who are the people who like this? The guys who were this linguistic theory on Aryan invasion, they loved it. The missionaries, they loved it because they could now tell Southern Indians that you're different from Northern Indians who subjugated you. That's why you're poor. So they turned around this whole poverty question into you're poor because they are subjugating you. So it served their interest and became the received wisdom as two language families. Whereas today's research, enlightened research is saying, like you correctly pointed out, India is a Sprackburn. It's a place where the antiquity of India, when you talk about just a genetic signal, 70,000 years, people have been living here. We cannot even imagine what language they have spoken. We cannot even imagine how it has sounded. Nothing like today's, because languages keep evolving. And we also know that northern and southern, when people are dispersed all over India, there must have been periods of isolation, long periods of isolation. And during that isolation, there must have been a few exchanges in trade, languages, and migrations and so on. So we are finding deeply embedded so-called Dravidian words in Sanskrit and deeply embedded Sanskrit words in so-called Dravidian, which is reflective of coexistence for a very, very long period of time. Sanskrit was codified by Panini. Panini was a grammarian who came in, I don't want to put a time frame on him. Westerners have put him to around 300 BC or so, but the internal evidence shows much earlier date for him. But he came with sets of grammar, rules, and how you form the sentences, arrangement of the vowels, the consonants in a certain form, logical form. Since then, we find that the evolution of Sanskrit has not been much because people have preferred this more pure form than the classical form. So that is also one way how people are done dating. They see how many archaic words are there in a text versus the more recent words, and they try to estimate the date based on that. That too has been one way of doing things. And as far as the Greek history is concerned, that's something I hear from people who write to me from either Eastern Europe or other places. They say it's not only Indian history that is messed up, it's their histories too. And they are also hopping mad about the whole thing, that they don't have agency to say what their history is, because the universities impose this on them, subject to this linguistic invasion from northern regions into their regions, and dividing, I think, Greek history into this Aegean period and the Minoans, Mycenaeans, Dorian invasions and whatnot, and all those kind of things.
And
So everybody's mad about it.
and there's lots of dark ages.
Dark ages, yes.
Multiple centuries. Nothing happened.
Right, right.
India has also dark ages, I believe, in the standard.
Yes, absolutely. In this current narrative, we supposedly in dark ages in the fall of the Gupta time frame, all the way down to maybe the enlightenment by the Islamics. So,
yeah, I think the thing that is a common thread throughout all different models of history in various cultures is this tendency to erase the causal nexus of ideas that pertain to humankind relating to the universe, and how that is applied to transform our relationship to the universe through free will and reason. And that's just completely swept aside in favor of one powerful culture just came in, caused a war, took over, and just don't think about the ideas. Don't think about all of this rich content that you could normally glean. But no, it's just a Hobbesian imposition of power onto the weak. And thus a new set of dynamics occurred, which is really destructive.
But you also have the synchrony of events across the globe. So if I'm not mistaken, the collapse of Harappan civilization, the disappearance of the Saraswati River, corresponds to the creation of the Sahara Desert.
John, but you're opening up a big can of worms. There's a lot of people on the list and not much time. Okay.
Thank you very much.
my pleasure.
So the next person who's been waiting for a while is Sean. Sean, are you still there?
Yeah, can you hear me? Does my sound good?
Yes, sir.
I hear you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Vedam. That was excellent. That was a good PowerPoint. It gave me a lot of reading material for this week and the continuing months. I'll just keep this real short just because there's lots of people behind me, but I liked that astronomy software that you had in your PowerPoint. I was just wondering what the name of that was.
Stellarium. It's called Stellarium. It's freeware, so you can download it from, I guess, I forget the organization. You search for it, you'll find it. You can download it.
Stellarium?
Stellarium. Stellarium.
R-I-U-M. Okay.
Stellarium
Excellent.
allows you to change the setting to different cultures. So they have culture of the Indians, culture of the Egyptians, culture of the Native Americans. So you can change the culture and see the star names the way those ancient cultures saw it.
So it basically works like a time machine.
Yes. You can climb back in time. Can climb back in time in the culture that you select. So that's a good part of it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Stephen, did you have a question?
I did indeed. Dr. Vedam, thank you so much. I've been reading in the alternative research field for the better part of 2 decades, so your lecture brought joy to my heart, and I'm very grateful that you took the time to do that. Thank you so much. I have 2 questions. I'll ask one, and then I'll go back in the queue if there's time afterwards. With the gang, I did a lecture last fall on Charles Hapgood's Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, in which we saw cartographic evidence that some unknown group, certainly back into the last ice age, had a level of technology that we would equate with the middle to late 1700s in terms of modern history. And I was struck by your thoughts on metaphoric interpretation of myth and nakashatras, the 27 times 13 1/3 degrees and all that. And it brought to mind the book Hamlet's Mill, in which they trace a series of myths to a common myth that encodes accurate processional astronomy. And I was just wondering if you were familiar with that and had any thoughts as to how advanced Indian technology or society may have gotten in high antiquity, because there's a lot of speculation in the alternative research field as to what that might have been.
Can you mention that word again, the one you talked about, processional?
Yeah, so the book is called Hamlet's Mill. they entitled that book that way because in one of in Shakespeare's works, Hamlet, they make oblique reference to this myth. But when you trace it back, it encodes accurate precessional astronomy according to these scholars, but they've been rejected. It's been rejected by mainstream scholars.
I see. I see.
But along that line, it kind of parallels what you said about that story with the 27, was it wives?
Wives, yes.
So I'm just wondering if
polygamous, yes.
Yeah, I wonder if you could share some thoughts on, I mean, I don't know the origin of the concept of metaphoric interpretation of myth and all that sort of stuff, but I was wondering if you could expand upon that a bit.
Sure, certainly we'll do that. I'm not familiar with this book. I'll certainly take a look at this Hamlet's Mill and see that. So the use of metaphors to communicate wisdom has got a long tradition in India, and I presume in many other cultures, including the Greek. And evidence for that is there all over. To take a modern contemporary view, I am a PhD engineer, and maybe I study let's say the power systems of North America. So I go and do a whole lot of linear algebra analysis, nonlinear systems, and I come up with some understanding of stability. However, to communicate to an operator in a power station what to do, I don't require that he have a PhD level mathematics understanding. So I might tell him, observe this frequency. If this frequency goes up to 61 hertz, you turn this knob. If the voltage goes below this, you turn that knob. Knowledge. He just needs to follow a procedure and it'll make it happen. So we are finding this kind of a formula-based knowledge in many cultures. In India especially, many practitioners are there who know the formulas, how to make things work, but don't have a clue on why it works. In an eyewitness account of this was done by Playfair. Playfair was a colonialist who came to India. Eyewitness account of the astronomy he found and everything. He says he found an Indian astronomer over there sitting on the ground with shells in his hand he's throwing the shells and using that for calculations, and he takes his palm leaves and he gets one more formula, does something. Then he gets the duration of the eclipse, when it will hold, how long it will last, and everything with great certainty. But he's got no clue why his formulas work. Neither is he interested. So Playfair says he's not interested either in why the formulas work. Well, those formulas are Aryabhata's formulas going back to almost 400 current era and so on. So he does not have need to understand this at a practitioner level. To understand that, he needed to go to an ancient university like Nalanda or Takshashila for 19 years and learn. If he did not want to do that, he just takes a formula and does what it is. So in ancient India, we are finding that stories were made to communicate information to the masses. We find that mechanism adopted often, that stories were used to communicate information, wisdom, astronomical wisdom, health wisdom, and other such things to the masses. So people would recount these stories. Even in a few generations ago, in India, people will quote a story as an example of how you should conduct yourself now. Not just in moralistic sense, but there's some wisdom coming out of that. So we are finding in the Puranas are literatures that can be dated to a rishi called Vedavyasa, who can be dated to approximately 3000 BCE based on the astronomy contained there. Most of the Purana literature goes to that time frame. They contain a rich exposition of stories, many stories involving divinities. And the funny thing is, the same divinity is used as an actor. If you can think of a palette of actors over there, they select a divinity, apply it in a context for a certain outcome. And that same phenomenon might be present by the same divinity in two different ways. For example, there's Ganesha. Ganesha is the divinity you've seen, elephant-headed divinity you've seen in temples in India. Ganesha is shown with one tusk called Ekadantaya. There are two stories on how he became Ekadantaya. One story says, the Rishi Vyasa wanted to write the Mahabharata and the Vedas and everything. He wanted somebody to write it down really fast, and Ganesha was that person. And when his pen did not work, he broke off his tusk and used it as a pen to write it down. So that's how he became single tusk, Eka Dantaya. Eka is one. And Dantaya is from dental. You can imagine the Sanskrit to Saxon, Anglo-Saxon kind of thing. Anyway, so another story says Ganesha ate so much one day and he was walking at night and he tripped and fell. And because he fell, the moon laughed at him. And therefore, in anger, he broke off a tusk and threw it at the moon. And that's how the moon became scarred. What do you make out of this? The same phenomenon of how we became single task is there in two stories. So people who have a shallow understanding of these things say Indian religiosity is so crazy because it makes no sense, it's contradictory. The issue is it's not religion that you're looking for over here. They use divinities as actors to play out these stories to communicate a certain wisdom. So in the case of the moon married the 27 daughters of King Daksha. He would spend a night with each of his wives. That was a metaphor that the moon falls back by 13 and 1/3 degrees in a 24-hour period. That's how much it moves in the sky. That's a rate at which it moves. That the wisdom communicated there. That same story also says that, by the way, that's encoding the sidereal month. Sidereal month is 27.3 days. It says that his father-in-law learned that moon loved one wife more than the others. Her name was Rohini. And he was furious. How can you treat my daughters unequally? So he curses his son-in-law that you're going to die for this transgression. So he goes off to Shiva, Mahadeva, prays and says, don't want to die. And Shiva says, don't worry, you will live a life of waxing and waning. And that story there is communicating this synodic month, which is approximately 29.5 days. That is encoded in that story. Further, the love affair of Chandra and Rohini, that itself I have interpreted in a TEDx talk as occultation phenomena. The moon occults several of these stars in its path along the ecliptic. But the moon's orbit, or the orbital geometry, is such that if the ecliptic is over here, the moon is tilted at 5 degrees to the ecliptic, which means the moon traces a path from -5 to +5 about the ecliptic. All the nakshatras are distributed across the ecliptic. Some are beyond 6 degrees, some are less than 6 degrees. If they're less than 6 degrees, they'll be occulted by the moon. If it's greater than 6 degrees, it will not be occulted by the moon because the moon only goes to plus and -5 degrees. So using this interpretation and the fact of the precession phenomena, I've shown there's a period of time when the moon occulted Rohini, which is Aldebaran, much more than the other nakshatras. So that was encoded in observational wisdom and stories as a love story of Chandra and the moon and Rohini. So this is one example. There's one more example of Dhruva. Dhruva was a kid who had an unhappy childhood at home. His father had married a younger woman, and you can imagine what's going to happen next. He got stepmotherly treatment at home. One day he tries to sit on his father's lap, and his stepmother comes and pushes him out, saying, you have no place on your father's lap, because her son would be sitting on that. In unhappiness, he leaves home to go and ask Bhagavan, what is my place on earth? And so he is doing tapas, meditation for many years, and Bhagavan appears, gives him a bone, asks him, what do you want? But he's enlightened by that time, and he wants nothing. He says, I don't want anything, because he's understood truth by that time. So he's said to have been made into a motionless star in the sky. And Bhagavan also said, all the stars and the Saptarshis also will go around you. So it's an encoding of the phenomenon of precision of rotation, that there is one immobile star in the sky and everything else in bigger and bigger circles go around that. Additionally, very important, Vishnu says, your mother Suniti, who's also unhappy, she'll also be a companion to you, a close star next to you. In today's Polaris, you don't find a close companion. But if you crank back in time to 3000 BCE, when Thuban was the pole star at that time, you find a close companion. So the time when the story was done, I've interpreted to 3000 BCE based on the astronomy as Vishnu promised this kid, Dhruva. So that is one more story. Like this, there are so many stories I can tell you. Let me tell you just one more story and I'll close out that question. There's a story about Pleiades. Pleiades in the Greek tradition. So the Greek tradition, Artemis is the protector of virgin girls, right? Virgins. So her proteges were the Pleiades. One day, Orion the hunter, he sees these Pleiades when they're playing in the lake or something. He's enamored by them, and he's a serial predator, keeps running after them. And Artemis is very, very unhappy. She doesn't want that. She goes and complains to Zeus. Zeus doesn't care. So eventually, Artemis goes and gets a scorpion to kill Orion. So once Orion is killed, Zeus comes and makes Orion and the Pleiades as stars in the sky. And even today, if you look at the eastern horizon, first Pleiades comes and behind is the Orion constellation. They're sailing the sky as if Orion is still chasing Pleiades. In the Greek tradition, it remembers the position. Pleiades comes first, Orion next. That is what that story is encoding. There is one more aspect to that story. The fact that there were 7 sisters Pleiades, but you can only see 6 of those stars. So people asked, what is it? Where is the missing star? And the Greek tradition says the 7th sister was Merope. Merope had an affair with a mortal. And so in shame, she hid her face. That's why you don't see Merope. So there is a story of something illegitimate romance. That is what is causing this. In the Indian tradition, we are told the Saptarishis is a great bear, by the way, the Big Dipper. The Kritikas, who are the equivalent of the Pleiades, were the wives of the Saptarishis. So we are told that, I don't want to go to the deep story over here, but there was an unfair accusation made against these beautiful women that they had an illicit romance with one of the divinities called Agni. So in shame, they left their husbands and went and became the Pleiades, the Kritika Nakshatra. However, there are only 6 of them, and there are 7 stars over here. What about the 7th one? The 7th one was called Arundhati, and she was very chaste, and she remained with her husband, who is Vashishta. And that turns out to be the stars we call Mizar Alcor. Even today, you can see as a binary star in the Big Dipper. So she did not leave because she was intimate that they had a romance over there, and something similar on this side also that caused this kind of a story. So bottom line, almost every Greek story we take parallels with Indian Puranic stories.
Great, thank you.
And a tradition of metaphors woven into stories. So if you have the key to unlock that wisdom, it makes sense to you. If you don't have the key to unlock that wisdom, it remains at a pedestrian level of mythology. So people who call it mythology really are ignorant. They don't understand. The ancients are not idiots. They were not people who just went and said, let us anthropomorphize all these inanimate things. No, they were doing that to encode a certain wisdom for common understanding. You should not have to require a PhD education to understand that. Everybody should know that. So for that, these stories are propagated in a way. Whether it is in Greece or whether it is in India or other parts, we are seeing similarly. And one has just got to interpret what these stories mean.
No, I'm pretty sure you need a PhD to have the right to have an opinion on anything. Otherwise, yeah, you should stay in a room and close your mouth. I think that's the common wisdom now. Yeah, no, absolutely. That was wonderful. And we have 2 questions left. And I would ask the 2 people just to make the questions as short as possible. We have Bill and Raj has been waiting for a long time. Raj, I know you have 2 big, fruitful, glorious questions, but I'll ask you to select one of the 2 when I call upon you. Bill, you can go first.
Yes, pranams, doctor. Very, very luxurious lecture that you just gave us and presented. I have a question, and it's a real simple one. It is, when was the adoption or the introduction on the timeline of Indian history of Hinduism?
Very good question. Very good question. So first of all, one has got to deconstruct what you just said. The deconstruction should be, what is this entity that you're referring to as Hinduism? That's a first question to deconstruct in what you're saying. So today, if somebody is a Hindu, the best understanding we have is you're a seeker of the truth. You're a seeker as opposed to a follower. You're not a follower, but you're a seeker. In doing seeking, what are you using as your reference points? And so if the reference points turn out to be the Upanishads, they turn out to be the Pramanas and the Darshanas, the philosophical schools that I talked about, or going all the way to the Vedas, that is what defines who a Hindu is. So that means, how old are these reference points we're talking about? The question comes, what is the antiquity of the Upanishads? What is the antiquity of Brahmanas, Samhitas, and so on? So Max Muller had a call on that. Using linguistics, he said 1200 BC to 200 BC. That is when Hinduism came into India. That's when all these things happened. But we are finding that the internal evidence seems to show far greater antiquity. So the starting point for many of these ideas, I would say, is when the Rig Veda was composed. The internal understanding is that these are not the works of a single person, but they were revealed wisdom in states of meditation and so on. It's not by human hands. So this is the understanding, but there's no time frame put on that. I have taken two stories from Rig Veda, the story of Aditi and the story of Ashwinis, and using astronomy, I've shown that one is 7,200 BCE, the other one is 6,000 BCE. It does not mean that that is when it started. This oral tradition could have been there for a very long period of time. India did not go through the ice ages the way ice ages were in Europe. India was still in a tropical place. So one can imagine that there's a continuity of civilization for quite a long time. I don't want to venture how old it might have been. In the Indian text, there are researchers. Now, I have not verified that. I'm only quoting to you what others have said. For example, Professor P.V. Vartak, he has written a book on scientific dating of the Mahabharata and other things. So he has found instances of seasons and others mentioned in several Indian texts that he's using the precision phenomena to try and date when that might have happened. The reason is in India, the seasons were always identified with the nakshatras. Nakshatras are sidereal again. Today, you might find, why did they even do that? Because you might say winter starts from here to here in Canada, fall is from here to here, and so on. They're tied to the solar months. Things don't change much in the Gregorian calendar. Maybe once in 7,000 years, you lose a day and so on. So, but in ancient world, it is lunisolar. Whether it is Egyptians, Babylonians, Indians, they use lunisolar calendars, pegging it to sidereal measurements. And that would change over time. So the months during which spring happened, summer happened, winter happened are noted in various works in Indian context. And using that, he has proposed it's a full precession cycle. A full precession cycle is around 26,000 years. I have no way of examining it yet. I have not gone into that. I have preferred to sit in this time frame in the 10,000 BCE and downwards time frame to see some of the developments. It might be far more ancient than that.
So just real quickly to reiterate, it's an ongoing ancient collection of all of the knowledge, 7 rishis, boom to now. But was there a point where it coalesced and became what's now referred to as a religion, as opposed to a whole body of knowledge going back past eternity?
So again, we need to deconstruct what a religion is. So
Okay.
with the founder statements, so it's a very, very tricky word to work with over there. So if your question asks, when did the ideas of Hinduism coalesce and others, we can talk about certain historical events over here. And one historical event tells us that Vedavyasa, who was a rishi, he recovered the Vedas. We are told he recovered the Vedas. From what we are not told. We are told that the Vedas are lost at a certain point in time. He recovered the Vedas. How did he recover it? He formed schools. He formed schools for the Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, Samaveda, Atharva Veda, and a rishi disciple system that will maintain that Veda, that will memorize, maintain over time. The memorization was not straightforward memorization. In today's electronics, we have something called error correction codes, so that what we are transmitting in zeros and ones, we can verify that indeed is a correct one by sending error probabilities. Similarly, in India, they had ways of reciting. For example, something, if you have a phrase which can be broken into 1, 2, 3, 4 phrases. Let's say, I like Coca-Cola. So 4 words over there. So it might mean 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4. Or some other complicated formula like 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, and so on. So they had error correction mechanisms of recitation in such a way that errors could be caught in what they were doing. So they had a precise way of doing. This is what Vedavyas's time onwards we can understand this kind of an oral recitation has taken place. So that is one history point, 3000 BC, where a lot of things are coming together. I would say these modern ideas of what we are thinking about Hinduism could have originated around there. But I'm not saying the origin is there. It is more or less a point where many things come together in time. Even in archeo-astronomy, the story of Dhruva that I said, the story of Kritikas that I said, everything is coming together in that time frame. So that is also the time when you see the Harappa civilization. Harappa is not the earliest civilization. Saraswati, Sindhu, I showed you radiometric dates going back to much more great antiquity. So these are difficult questions. I think we have to just wait for more evidence to come and strengthen the claims. Until that time, 3000 BC.
Pranams.
Excellent. For the final question, Raj has just informed me that his microphone is not working, but he did write down his two questions. It's difficult to select which one is the most important of the two, but what I'll do is just share first a contribution he made, which I just think has value that should be put on the record, and which I think that any researcher who's looking for something of substance to poke into should really follow this up. You could speak to this, Dr. Vedam, if you wish, where Raj points out Dmitry Mendeleev, who discovered the periodic table, as it is called in the West, was influenced by Acharya Panini's Ashtadhyayani and the rules and frameworks that were built by Panini. Mendeleev ascribed his success, how his periodic table among dozens floating around during his time, to the structure and logic of Panini. I think that is just extraordinary as an idea. I don't know if that's something you want to speak to, or if I should just throw that out there and let it float around.
Sure. In fact, I'll give a reference to that work. So Professor Subhashka, and he's got a couple of essays, and one particular essay on Medium, which is on Indian science. I think, I don't know the name of the title, but it's got science in the heading. So that has got a reference to what Raj has just mentioned, how Mendeleev, when he was trying to find a structure for the periodic table, if you remember from our high school lessons, is an arrangement of the elements in terms of the atomic number, the atomic weights, and depending on where it is, it's either it doesn't have any valence electrons to have reactions, or it is highly reactive, all those kind of things. So Panini, he organized the alphabets in Sanskrit in a certain way. Today, when we study English, you just study A, B, C, D up to Z, and you're also told embedded inside that are vowels A, E, I, O, U. This is what you're told, consonants in this, and it's one straight recitation from A to Z. However, in the Indian system, we have the vowels pulled out and the consonants pulled out. In the vowels, you have A, E, U, and so on. And the consonants, you have the sounds in a certain way. For example, ka, k, ga, g, na, cha, ch, ja, j, na, ta, ta, da, da, na, pa, pa, ba, ba, ma, yara, lava, and so on. What am I doing? Some sounds are made in the back of the throat. Some sounds are made by the tongue hitting the top of my mouth. Some sounds are made by the lips coming down. So Panini studied the structure, the morphology of these sounds and arranged them in a certain way. And this is what we call the aksharamala, the consonants over here. So this kind of an arrangement allowed for certain understanding of the properties and obviously transmitting them from time. So Mendeleev was influenced by this, and the evidence for that is provided by Subhashka in that essay that I told you. Go to Medium, or I think it was a Medium article. I could be mistaken, but he's got several hyperlinks over there. So follow through the hyperlinks, and you'll find what I'm talking about here.
Fantastic. Okay, good. All right, so I'll end with this one question by Raj, and then we'll. I know you have another presentation this evening, so you're remarkably generous to have given up so much time already. Raj had asked, is it true that the coastal areas of Atlantic and Baltic Europe have many words that have greater Sanskrit influences than the more inland tongues? The theory behind it was that the Indians were great seafarers, tradesmen who traveled extensive distances, taking Indian goods and hence language, culture, values, etc. Is there a book, research, etc., that you may have come across on this point? Thank you.
So there are elements of truth over there. One will have to be very careful of the claims that we are making. So yes, there is some evidence that the coastal areas have got more Sanskrit than the internal. We'll start from India itself. In India, we're seeing that in the coastal areas, especially in the coastal areas, we are seeing that the southern words are more in northern India, especially in the coastal areas, because of the trade, the maritime trade that I talked about, wherever, and the words were in relation to commerce. In relation to commerce, those are the words that are imported. So some evidence of that is over there. In the history of the Mediterranean peoples and others, the Phoenicians and seafaring people appear prominently. So who were these people? So there is a theory that the Fani of the Rig Veda were identified as the Phoenicians that is present in the European histories. They were same seafaring people who went to various parts of the world inserting this culture. Now, to say that they were the only ones who took language, then you'll only find evidence in the coastal areas. But we find evidence in the interiors also, as in Central Asia, as in Bosphorus, as in, what are those countries' names? I forget the countries' names. Not only Lithuania, Ukraine, but many other places with deep substrate of Sanskrit, we find them, these things. In the histories of the Hittites, of the Mitannis, of all of these people, we are told that several things caused their downfall. Around 1300 BC, 1400 BC, they had smallpox epidemics that caused them to crash. We're also told that there were attacks by seafaring people. Who are these seafaring people? We have no idea. We have no idea. So chances are that yes, there has been impact of seafarers from Dwaraka, from Pumpuhar, other known ancient ports. Dwaraka was a port 9,000 years ago based on carbon dating, and Pumpuhar, I've just been talking to you about that, last ice ages, 18,000 years ago. So they were trading. With whom they were trading, we don't know. So there's every chance that it is a well-developed maritime trade that was happening for a long period of time. Maybe I'll add one more point. In the last Republic Day celebration in India, which is not this year but the previous year, every January 26th, India honors several scientists, inventors, or bearers of culture and so on. One of the persons they honored was from the island of Lakshadweep, which is on the west coast of India. And he, I think his name was Manik Kaffan, Abdul Manik Kaffan, I forget the exact name. But he was honored because he's the last living person who knows the art of making ships in a certain way. When I said that Indians had a maritime 15,000 years ago, the logical question in your mind should be, wait a minute. Ships today, we have iron nails and other galvanized nails that don't allow rusting, and that's how they hold things together in the deep waters. What did Indians do? So there apparently was a technology to make ships using certain joints and coir. Coir was made out of ropes and other things, coconut husk and fibers. And there was a technology of making that. This technology was lost upon Muslim invasions. The Muslims took over this entire maritime trade, and they were controlling this technology. And the Muslims had converted all the people in the islands, Lakshadweep, Minicoy, and others, and this technology continued over there. And the last exponent of that is this gentleman I talked about. He's about 80 years old, who knew how to make these ships. And he made one such ship for Irish adventurer, millionaire, who contracted him to make a ship that used to sail between India to Red Sea, using the same technologies. A picture of that is also there on Google, you can see that. So he was honored for that. So this tells us that there were technologies to make ships of a certain kind in ancient India. That technology is perhaps dying out. Anecdotally, when Vasco da Gama came through the Cape of Good Hope to Calicut in India, he said that the Indian ships are far bigger than his ships, far bigger than his ships. So that we find it difficult to imagine that because we are lost so much. But going back to Vasco da Gama's accounts, British accounts, French eyewitness accounts, we can reconstruct some of the maritime culture that existed in India at that time.
Dr. Vedam, thank you so much. And I got to say, if anybody is listening to this on YouTube or other platforms that we broadcast on, and you are of a Medici character wishing to sponsor a university, this is a project here where I'm sure Dr. Vedam, I mean, Jerry sort of made a joke that it does feel like we just compressed a university education in summary form into a dense now what has become a 3-hour, 3.5-hour presentation.
Goodness.
But really, honestly, this could very easily be a full-blown educational process in a university. My God, the potential is wide open.
By the way, I do offer it as a university course. We have a Hindu University of America where I offer a 2-term course on reconstructing this history. So the second course, the class I'm taking now is a 9th session over there. There are 20 sessions. We meet over 20 sessions of 2 hours each, where we examine the details, the evidence in detail, and analyze these things. I've also started offering short-term courses in Indian universities to help propagate this knowledge.
So it's begun. That's good. And can anybody participate or sign up and register?
Absolutely.
Do you have to be embedded? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, anybody can. Hindu
So
University of America.
send us the
love for
information
people
for
to-
that, and then we'll make that available as well. I mean, I want to. I'm sure a
Yes.
lot of other people hearing this will also want to jump on board.
Mhm.
That's
Sure,
great.
certainly. I'll send you the information.
Please. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for taking this Sunday afternoon to edify the soul and the mind. And we're going to continue this next week with a plunge into the works of Dante Alighieri and some of what was behind Dante's intentions and thinking when he composed his cantos and the Divine Comedy and more. So hope to see everybody here next Sunday at 2 p.m. Dr. Vedam, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Deeply appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. Deeply appreciate everybody's inputs into this. Thank you.
Bye-bye.